pandemics. So it's great to be back here and have everybody here, as well as those joining us online. We will go through the rules in order in 5 sessions. So we need to move, we need to be conscious of the timing to move along with the purpose of helping us all become better with the rules, and therefore become better rules officials for the WSGA to serve the WSGA better. That, we're not here to debate the rules, show how clever we are and so forth. We're here simply to help each other learn the rules. And so we'll have a good championship season. And we're very fortunate to have an extremely strong association rules wise, both in terms of the staff and in terms of the committee. And that was, really shown at the U.S. Mid-Amateur back in September at Erin Hills and Blue Mound, where toward the end of that championship, it looked an awful lot like a WSGA championship. When you saw, who was refereeing, who was an observer, and everything. It was just great to see so many of our rules committee volunteers, as well as the staff involved in that. And I think that says a lot, that especially with the extension of that championship, that WSGA was able to help fill in the gaps as it ran day and a half late. So with 2023, this is a rules change year. It's been 4 years since the rules were significantly updated. The updates for this cycle are much less grand in scale, but there are some changes, and Dan Stoper and I'll point out the changes as we go along, with the more significant changes. So there's some changes to the rules. There are some new clarifications that have been published, but also if you look in the start of the official guide, you'll also see that several dozen interpretations have been withdrawn, either because they weren't necessary or because their message has been incorporated into the rules, and those interpretations or those clarifications are no longer needed, which is a great step. So with all that in mind, let's dive in with Rule 1. And as Dan and I go through this, at the start of each rule, we will go over any definitions that apply to that particular rule. And with Rule 1, we just have one definition, and that is the one of definition of general penalty, which simply provides that any reference to the general penalty refers to a penalty of loss of hole in match play or 2 strokes in stroke play. So it's just shorthand in the rules that wherever we see the player gets the general penalty, that we know it's loss of hole or 2 strokes, depending on the form of play. So we'll start with Rule 1 with the purpose of the rule. And before we dive into that, just a brief comment on these purpose statements that you'll see at the start of each rule and occasionally before a particular section of a rule. And that is, these were a very nice introduction to the rules in 2019, because they help give us some, a little bit of philosophical guidance as to what this rule is trying to accomplish. That, when we read the purpose statement, we can see, okay, I see now why this rule is written the way it is, why it prohibits that act or allows this other act, because it's consistent with what it's trying to do. But the other thing the other way these statements can be useful is if you run into a situation, whether on a rules quiz or while officiating, and you're not sure of the answer. You think the answer is either, let's say a 2-stroke penalty or no penalty, but you're really not sure. Obviously, if you're officiating, please get on radio and ask. But, say if you're at the other end of that radio and you're not sure yourself as to what the answer is, sometimes it can be helpful, go back to the purpose statement, say, okay, which of these 2 possible outcomes is more consistent with the purpose of the rule in question? That I'm not saying that can happen a lot, but every now and then that can provide guidance, and it makes sense to err on the side when it's clear of the outcome that's more consistent with the principle set forth in the purpose statement. So with that, let's look at the purpose statement for Rule 1. Rule 1 introduces these three principles to the game. Play the course as you find it, play the ball as it lies, and we'll see specific rules that reinforce those principles. Play by the rules and in the spirit of the game. We'll go into that in detail soon. And then, and this is an important one, we'll go into detail soon also. You are responsible for applying your own penalties if you breach a rule, so you cannot gain a potential advantage over another player. And this is, perhaps the number one way that golf is different from so many other sports. So many other sports that have officials, whether it's football, basketball, baseball, players are allowed, if not encouraged, to see what they can get away with in terms, that if the official doesn't call something, then hey, good for them. If the official doesn't call holding, then good for them. But golf is just the opposite, where players are actively discouraged from doing that. In fact, players can wind up being disqualified if they do try to get away with something. And that makes golf a very, very different sport, and is part of the reason why it's such a special game, because of the outlook it provides, that it expects that players play honestly, and that's quite refreshing. So now, rule itself, rule 1.1, the game of golf is played in a round of 18 or fewer holes on a course by striking a ball with a club. So, one important detail there is, it's certainly fine to have fewer than 18 holes. For example, if one hole is closed for construction and they have a 17-hole round, that's fine. Or if you want to have 9-hole rounds, that's okay also. I know, I think Jeff and I have talked about cases where there could be bad weather coming in, and the committee wants to try to get as much golf in as they can. And they say, hey, instead of having an 18-hole round, let's have 2 9-hole rounds today, so that as long as everyone completes that first 9, we can use, if necessary, the 9-hole scores, since that's their own separate round, and that's okay. Each hole starts with a stroke from the teeing area and ends when the ball is holed on the putting green. For each stroke, the player must play the course as they find it. In Rule 8, we'll get into that in more detail. And the player must play the ball as it lies. In Rule 9, we'll see that. So an example, the first one, if your ball winds up in a bad lie, let's say with a tree branch interfering, you just have to accept that. If your ball winds up in a divot hole, you have to accept that. You can't move the ball out of the divot hole. But inevitably, there are exceptions to these two principles. And if there weren't, the rules book would be a lot shorter than it is. Such as what happens if you hit your ball into 5 feet of water. Well, we can't expect the player to play that ball. So there is a procedure for the player to take relief from a penalty area. So there are exceptions to that. Rule 1.2, standards of player conduct. And right away in the title of 1.2a, it sets the high bar and puts players on notice. Conduct expected of players. It's not recommended conduct, it's expected conduct, which lets people know that this is an important message to send, especially to newcomers to the game. All players are expected, not urged, but are expected to play in the spirit of the game by acting with integrity, as we just talked about, by being honest, calling penalties on themselves, by showing consideration to others, which includes playing quickly, thinking about safety in terms of where you take practice swings and so forth, not distracting others, taking good care of the course, repair ball marks, rake bunkers, things like that. Now, there is no penalty under the rules for failing to act in this way, except the committee may disqualify a player if it finds the player has committed serious misconduct. So what is serious misconduct? Well, as the next paragraph says, it's player behavior that's so far removed from what is expected that the most severe sanction of removing a player from the competition is justified. So certainly, when we think of other sports, if Jeff and Thomas are playing together and Thomas just hauls off and slugs Jeff, that would qualify. We know that. We've seen that from other sports. But what else from golf? Well, let's look at interpretation 1.2a/1 on page 27 that provides some guidance. And it's a long one. We won't go through all of it, but the keys are really in this first paragraph. In determining whether a player has committed serious misconduct, the committee must consider all the circumstances. Even if the committee thinks the misconduct is serious, it has the option to take the view that it's more appropriate to warn the player that a repeat will result in disqualification instead of disqualifying the player right away. So, for example, if a player throws a club, could a committee say, hey, we think that's serious misconduct, you're disqualified? Committee could, and in some cases that'd be the right thing to do. But in other cases, the committee might say, hey, approach the player and say, hey, look, we know things are running a little hot today, but that behavior is not acceptable. And if it happens again, you will be disqualified. And I think to some degree that's human nature, to warn players to say, do that again, and you will be disqualified. So a committee certainly has that option. Then the clarification goes on to list examples of actions that would and would not be considered serious misconduct. In the first case, where examples that are likely to be serious misconduct, deliberately causing serious damage to a putting green. So keys there are, it's a deliberate act, it's not an accident, and it's serious damage to the putting green. I believe there was a case several years ago with Sergio Garcia, where he was disqualified from the European Tour for that. Endangering the safety of others, such as by throwing a club at another player. Well, that makes sense to say, one strike and you're out. Deliberately distracting other players while they are making strokes. So one common theme you see through a number of these examples is the use of deliberately. So in other words, for someone who's just a jerk, he's intentionally doing something to endanger somebody, to distract somebody, to damage the course. This person's just a bad actor, and we don't want him on the golf course. Now, examples of actions that are unlikely to be considered a serious breach are slamming a club on the ground, something that, we've all done, but, something that doesn't endanger anybody and does not cause serious damage to the course, or, notice carelessly distracting another player making a stroke. It's one thing if you intentionally cough or say something during another player's downswing, but if you accidentally sneeze during another player's downswing, that's not serious misconduct. Is it nice? No, but it might be something that was beyond your control. You weren't trying to interfere with that other player's play. All right, so back to the rule 1.2a. At the end, it says penalties other than disqualification may be imposed for player misconduct only if they are part of a code of conduct that the committee has adopted. So in other words, if there is no code of conduct and the committee sees a player throw a club, the committee, it's all or nothing for the player, either no penalty or disqualification, or something in the middle is to warn the player and say, hey, that's not acceptable, do it again, and you're out of here. But the committee could not penalize that player 2 strokes. If the committee wants to, what it could do is establish a code of conduct prior to the competition that spells out certain things, such as if you throw a club, you will be penalized 2 strokes. If the committee says that in advance, then that would be okay. And as we see at the end of the next section with the code of conduct, in section 5, I think that's I of committee procedures, and we won't look at that, has some guidance for committees that are looking to establish its own code of conduct. And you see that often at, say, high school or college golf. All right, rule 1.3. Oh, and one point I should have mentioned at the start is that, especially to help everyone online, what we are going to do this year with these sessions is if you please wait and ask any questions at the end of that rule. That's just a more organized way to go through the questions, and it's easier for the people listening in online to process those questions. So please, if something comes up, please just jot something down, and at the end of Rule 1, let's talk about it. Rule 1.3, playing by the rules. We start off by clarifying what is meant by the term rules. It's the 25 rules plus the definitions and any local rules that are in effect. It goes on to say players are also responsible for the terms of the competition. Could be entry requirements such as age or handicap requirements and so forth. Rule 1.3b, applying the rules. As we've talked about before, the player is responsible for applying the rules themselves. And that's a key part of golf. Players are expected to recognize when they've breached a rule and to be honest in applying their own penalties. So they're expected, one, to recognize when they've breached a rule, which means the players need to know the rules, right? Because they're expected when there's a breach to apply the rules. And then we go on to say if a player knows that they've breached a rule that involves a penalty and deliberately fails to apply that penalty, the player is disqualified. So that could be in both match play and stroke play. Could be a one-stroke penalty, could be a general penalty. If the player knows that they've incurred a penalty, the player can't just can't stay quiet and hope no one notices. Next point, if two or more players agree to ignore any rule or penalty that they know applies, and any of those players have started the round, they are disqualified, even if they have not acted on that agreement. So, the first point here is that this provision applies only when players know the rules, when they know that they're not allowed to do what they are doing. So, for example, if Dan and I are playing and I hit my ball into a red penalty area, I'm going to take lateral relief. And I say, Dan, look at this. Within 2 club lengths, this rough is 6 inches high, but just a little bit outside it, it's a more manageable 2 inches high. Would it be okay if we fudge things a little bit and let me drop farther than the rule allows? Dan says, well, John, I know the rules say you got to drop within 2, but yeah, that seems a little severe. So yeah, go ahead and let's just make it 3 club lengths. And now at that moment, and I say, thanks, Dan, you're a swell guy. And now at that moment, what's the result? We are disqualified even before I drop the ball, right? Because what triggers the breach of this rule is that agreement. It doesn't matter whether we actually act on that. So in that case, we are both disqualified because we both know the rules. Now, what happens if you have 2 beginners, don't know anything about the rules? They hit their ball into the same spot. One person says, yeah, I think I'm supposed to drop outside it. Other player says, yeah, it doesn't seem right to have to drop in the 6-inch grass. Why don't you just drop in the shorter stuff? Yeah, that's probably the right way to go. Then they proceed. Now, is there any agreement to waive the rules that would result in disqualification there? No, there is not. But, and if it's in match play, what's the ruling? Well, they just continue on, no penalty. But what if that happens in stroke play? What's the ruling? Then the player who dropped and played from the wrong place, from, say more than 2 club lengths from the penalty area edge, has played from the wrong place. So he is going to be penalized. 3 penalty strokes, 1 for taking relief and 2 for playing from the wrong place. So he is still on the hook for not having proceeded correctly, but there is no disqualification penalty. And where it talks about, starting the round and everything, that addresses the rare situation where, let's say on the way to the course, Jeff and I are riding together in the car, And let's say this is whether it's match play or stroke play, and we say, and I say, Jeff, I'm not driving it very well, and this is a very tight course with out of bounds on both sides on most holes. Would it be okay if we just cut me some slack and by about for both of us, we treat out of bounds like a red penalty area, and we just drop 2 club links from where a ball went out of bounds rather than using stroke and distance? And Jeff says, oh, wow, yeah, I know we're not allowed to do that. That's not the right procedure, but yeah, since you're a friend, John, yeah, let's do that. Now, what happens if right before either one of us tees off, Jeff says, John, I've been thinking about that. I'm just not comfortable with that agreement. Let's play by the rules today. I say, fine, Jeff, we'll do it your way. We'll play by the rules. In that case, any penalty? No penalty, because we have not yet teed off with that agreement in place. But what happens if if we don't have that second conversation? I get up there, I tee off, and I actually hit the fairway. And then before Jeff tees off, he says, John, I'm just not comfortable with that agreement we made. I want to rescind that agreement. In that case, what's the ruling? In that case, it's disqualification for both of us, right? Because one of the 2 parties in agreement, it started the round with the agreement still in place. All right, next bullet under 1.3b1, when it's necessary to decide questions of fact, such as where did a ball last cross the edge of a penalty area? A player is responsible for considering not only their own knowledge, but also all other information that's reasonably available, such as if a player hit his ball toward a penalty area and there were spectators nearby, player might, is responsible for seeing if they have any information they could share. The player may ask for help with the rules from a referee or the committee, but if that's not available within a reasonable time, the player must play on. And we'll see in match play, if the opponent doesn't like the choice the player makes, the opponent can request a ruling. And in stroke play, if the player is not sure what to do, the player may play a second ball. All right, next section, talking about reasonable judgment. Many rules require a player to determine a spot, point, line, edge, area, or other location, such as perhaps the most common, where did the ball last cross the edge of a penalty area? That, this might happen 200 yards away. It's, we can't expect the player to know exactly from 200 yards away where that ball last crossed the edge of the penalty area. So we're going to have to cut the player some slack, and say as long as the player used their reasonable judgment, we will accept that. An example, even replacing a ball on its original spot on the putting green. Some people will say that, strictly speaking, it's pretty much impossible to replace a ball exactly from the spot from which it was lifted. So that's why we say, well, as long as you use reasonable judgment in doing so, that you've satisfied the requirement for replacing the ball. Then the last 2 items are new for this year, that in terms of determining the area of the course where the ball lies. So it could be, let's say a player hits his ball toward a boundary. There are 2 white stakes, but they're 50 yards apart. There's tall grass, intervening bushes and branches, and he does his absolute best to determine whether the ball is inbounds or out of bounds. And if given the circumstances, he does what's reasonable, then he's satisfied the requirement. And if he determines that the ball is in fact in bounds, then that's the way we will proceed. Now, such determinations must be made promptly, because every time a player has such a situation, you don't necessarily want him to stop play and ask for a ruling. You want him to be able to continue to play promptly, and often can't be precise just because of their very nature. But as long as the player does what can be reasonably expected in the circumstances, the reasonable judgment will be accepted, even if after that stroke is made, that determination is shown to be wrong. For example, if there's video evidence showing that in fact was incorrect. that as long as the player did his best to determine, for example, where the ball last crossed the edge of a penalty area, drops and plays, and then video shows that, well, actually the ball crossed 5 yards up or 5 yards back, that we will not say that the players played from a wrong place. So this helps protect the player. However, if the player becomes aware of a wrong determination before the stroke is made, it must be corrected. So if a player uses reasonable judgment, with the penalty area example, drops a ball, but then before he plays, someone, let's say a rules official, rides up and says, well, hold on. On TV, they had a very good look at where the ball last crossed the edge of the penalty area, and it turns out it was 5 yards back. Then the player is he's not yet played, even though he's dropped, but he's not yet played, is then obligated to lift the ball and proceed correctly. All right, rule 1.3c, penalties. First, when does a player get a penalty? Penalty applies when a breach of a rule results from a player's own actions or actions of their caddy. It also applies if another person takes an action that the player himself is not allowed to take, and that person does so at the player's request or at the player's authority. So you have a player, ball is near a tree, there's a tree branch interfering with his backswing. Player says, I know I can't move or break that tree branch, but I'm going to ask the spectator to do so. That ought to be okay. Then the spectator does so, improving the player's area of intended swing. Well, it would be treated as if the player himself had broken the branch, and the player would be penalized, which is certainly the desired outcome. And then likewise, something a little less black and white is that if the player sees another person, could be a player, could be somebody else like a spectator or a gallery marshal, about to take an action concerning the ball or equipment they know would breach the rules if the player himself had done so, and the player does not take reasonable steps to object or stop it from happening, then the player will be penalized as if the player himself had done so. So back to the tree branch example, the player's walking up, he sees the tree branch, but then he sees, a spectator walking over in slow motion, and it's pretty clear that the spectator is about to break that tree branch, so the player won't have to deal with it. If the player is close enough to do something to stop that, the player is obligated to do so. The player can't just tell the caddy, here, just stay back for a second, this is our lucky day. Can't do that. Next section, levels of penalties. We'll see there are three levels of penalties. And why are there penalties? They're meant to cancel out any potential advantage gained, as well as to serve as a deterrent. One stroke penalty can apply in both match play and stroke play in situations where either the advantage is very minor, such as a player moves his ball in play and replaces it. So he's ultimately playing from the right place. So he really hasn't gained any meaningful advantage, but he would get a one-stroke penalty. Or the player is taking penalty relief, such as for an unplayable lie. That's part of the procedure. The general penalty, which we've discussed, is loss of hole in match play, two strokes, and stroke play, where the potential advantage is more significant. So notice that what the rules concern themselves with is the potential advantage and not just the actual advantage. Then the third level of penalty is disqualification. Again, applies in both match play and stroke play. As we saw earlier, it could involve serious misconduct, but also involve situations where the potential advantage is too significant for the player's score to be considered valid. In other words, where you can't really quantify the potential advantage the player has received. For example, take the Island Green 17th at TPC Sawgrass. Player comes to that hole on Sunday with a 5-shot lead. Player hits the ball in the water. player says, I know the rules won't say I should replay from the tee or go to the dropping zone or take back on line relief, but it's so windy and my nerves are so bad, I don't think I can do it. I'm just going to go drop up on the fringe of the putting green, and I'll accept whatever penalty there. I'll take a 2-stroke penalty for playing from the wrong place. Now, if the player were to do that, the player has played from the wrong place, but as we'll see under Rule 14, there's also the provision that for a serious breach of playing from the wrong place in stroke play, a player can be disqualified. And why would this player be looking at potential disqualification? Because it's hard to say how much advantage this player would receive. Is it a 2-stroke advantage, a 4-stroke advantage, an 8-stroke advantage? You can't really say. In this case, if you told this player, hey, it's a 4-stroke penalty for you to go drop on the putting green and play, he might say, okay, done, I'll take it, thank you. And that's not really how we want players to play the game. So that's an example where we really can't quantify the advantage the players gained, and therefore why we have to bring in the possibility of disqualification. Now, no discretion to vary penalties, and this is important, and it goes back to the whole point of why we have the rules of golf in the first place, because we want to make sure that a player who does something in Sheboygan, and then a player does the same thing in lacrosse, and a player does the same thing in Arizona, and a player does the same thing in New Zealand, that they all get the same result. That if they all get different results, then we really haven't achieved much by having this code of rules. So it's important that the penalties are applied as they're provided in the rules, and neither a player nor the committee has authority to apply penalties in a different way. So for example, a committee can't just say, you've breached a rule, that's a 2-stroke penalty, but I've never really liked that rule. Let's just say it's 1 stroke and call it a day. Can't do that. A wrong application of a penalty or a failure to apply a penalty may stand if it's too late to correct it. And we'll go into detail about that in Rule 20. Then in match play, 2 players may agree how to decide a rules issue as long as they don't agree to ignore a rule or a penalty they apply. So if something comes up and they say, geez, we don't know what to do, and whether they say, well, let's just consider the hole tied, or come up with something else, or if they say, it makes sense that you'd be able to drop and play from over there without penalty, that as long as they don't know that what they're doing is wrong, that's okay. And whatever they do is final. But that to emphasize is just for match play. All right, next section, applying penalties to multiple breaches of the rules. This is one of the biggest changes for this year. And this is something that has made all of our lives much easier and much less complicated. That the question can come up, what happens when a player breaches multiple rules or breaches the same rule multiple times? Is it a 2-stroke penalty, a 4-stroke penalty, 6-stroke penalty? What is it? And previously it wasn't easy to wade through all that and figure out what the total penalty would be. But all that has now been greatly simplified, which is terrific for all of us. So whether a player gets multiple penalties depends as to whether there's been an intervening event and on what the player did. So what is an intervening event? There are 2 types. 1, making a stroke, and 2, becoming aware or already being aware of a breach of the rules. And that includes a situation where the player is uncertain whether or not they've breached a rule. So penalties are applied as follows. If a single penalty is applied for multiple breaches between intervening events. Player breaches multiple rules or the same rule multiple times between intervening events, the player gets only 1 penalty. So let's look at a couple of examples of that. Let's say my ball's in deep rough. I go over and and I, not knowing the rules well, say, gee, this doesn't seem fair. I press down the grass behind my ball, proving the lie. And then I turn to Dan, another player, and I say, Dan, what do you think I should do from here? Do you think I should go for the green, or do you think I should lay up? So I've breached two rules. I've improved the lie of the ball, and I've asked for advice from someone I'm not allowed to ask advice from. So in that particular case, what is going to be my, and then I play the ball, what will be my total penalty in stroke play? The stroke play would be a total of 2 strokes. Match play, it's straightforward. I lost the hole as soon as I improved the lie of the ball. Now, let's look at another situation where, let's say my ball is in a bunker, and I'm taking practice swings in that same bunker, touching the sand each time. And then I go ahead and play the shot. And I have no idea what I did was a breach. Now, in that case, 2-stroke penalty, right? Whether, I touched the sand 2 times or 5 times. But now let's say on the next hole, I'm in a bunker, touch the practice ground sand with the practice swing. And Dan says, John, I'm not sure you're allowed to do that. I say, Dan, thanks, but trust me, I know the rules. This is perfectly fine. And then I take another practice swing and I touch the sand, and then I play the ball. Now, in that case, how many penalty strokes would I get in stroke play? Then I would get 4 penalty strokes. And the reason is there was an intervening event that Dan said, that is a breach, or I think that's a breach. There's at least uncertainty as to whether I was allowed to do that. And once that happens, I'm on the hook for then proceeding correctly with everything I do beyond that time. So take another example. Let's say I take practice swing. Well, no, we'll leave that alone. Now, if it goes on, say, if the rules breached have different penalties, the player gets only the higher level penalty. So let's say before my stroke, I do something that gets me a 1-stroke penalty, then I get something that gets me a 2-stroke penalty. So let's say I lifted the ball for identification without having marked its spot. And then I ask Dan for advice. Now I've got a 1-stroke penalty and a 2-stroke penalty, but we know I'm just going to get a single penalty, which means I'm going to get the higher level penalty, which is the 2-stroke penalty. Multiple penalties apply for breaches before and after intervening events. So situation where, Dan advised me between practice swings, I wasn't allowed to do that. Then I'm going to be on the hook for multiple penalties. Or, a situation where, let's say I play a ball from the bunker. Before I play that bunker shot, I take practice swings touching the sand. I play the shot, thin it over the green into another bunker, go into that other bunker, take practice swings in the sand. In that case, I'm going to get 2 penalty strokes each time. So I'd get 4 penalty strokes because I made a stroke in the middle. And once you make a stroke, the penalty clock resets and you start all over. The exception is failure to replace a moved ball, where the player will wind up with just the general penalty. He'll wind up in stroke play with 2 penalty strokes and not 3 penalty strokes. But a reminder that any penalty strokes that are part of the relief process, such as for penalty areas or an unplayable lie, that penalty stroke will stay with the player. That does not get absorbed into that. So nice change that really simplifies things. Any questions on Rule 1 there? Yes.
A 36-hole championship round is 1 round or 2 rounds?
36-hole championship round is 2 rounds in match play. And the reason that's significant is that means, between rounds, you can practice, change clubs, ask for advice, things like that. Yeah, that's a good question. All right.
John, I have a question.
Okay.
If you know that you have breached the rules, do you agree that you will always get a penalty for the multiple breaches? So in your example, you said the player improves one of the conditions affecting the stroke, and then also asks for advice on how to play the shot. you said you don't get multiple penalties. If the player knows that he cannot improve cats and knows that he cannot give advice, do you agree that the intervening event rule really doesn't apply and he's going to get 4 points?
Oh, okay. So Dan's question is, if the player knows he's not allowed to improve the lie of the ball, and he knows he's not allowed to ask for advice, but he goes ahead and does both, is he always going to get 4 penalty strokes? And the answer to that is yes, that falls under that first bullet point of simply being aware of a breach of the rules. So in that case, the player would be penalized. And then,
So Dan's gonna get multiple penalties every time because we have to assume.
that's right, Dan. So everyone's gonna be looking for you this
Me,
year.
I got nothing. to do about it.
Okay, all right, here we have an online question on reasonable judgment. Player marks the ball on green, lifts the ball up 2 inches and moves the ball half an inch closer to the hole. Is this reasonable judgment or is this cheating? Well, this sounds similar to what something happened on it. Well, it's not similar to that, but a half inch is something. The way to approach a question like that is to say, could a player reasonably have done better than half an inch in replacing the ball? And a half an inch is a pretty good distance. So I would think in this case, yes, the player could have done better. And therefore, I guess I would start by perhaps giving the player a bit of benefit of doubt and saying, okay, player, maybe he's not cheating, but was just sloppy in how he or she replaced the ball and therefore is going to be penalized for playing from the wrong place. But if this happens several times, then that might strengthen the argument that maybe this player is cheating and should be disqualified for serious misconduct rather than just penalized for each time for playing from the wrong place. So hope that helps. All right, on to rule 2, which will start with several definitions in the back of the book. One is areas of the course, which is on page 328. We talk about the 5 defined areas, and that's largely what Rule 2 is going to talk about, different areas of the course. The general area, the teen area that the player must play from. So, which means that while you're starting play of the 3rd hole, the teen area is your teen area for the 3rd hole, and so what would be the status of the teen area for, say, the 5th hole nearby? That would be part of the general area, wouldn't it? And all penalty areas are area of the course, bunkers, and the putting green of the hole the player is playing. Next definition is course on page 332. The course is the entire area of play within the edge of any boundaries set by the committee. So the word any is important to note because that means that nothing is automatically out of bounds, that something is out of bounds only if the committee says it is out of bounds. So property ownership does not determine whether something is out of bounds or not. So that means committees need to be diligent with their responsibilities for defining the course. All areas inside the boundary edge are in bounds and are part of the course. All areas outside the boundary edge are out of bounds and therefore are not part of the course. And the boundary edge extends up above the ground as well as below the ground. And that can come into play, but sometimes you have trees near boundary lines. Sometimes you have culverts near boundary lines that are underground. So it's important to know the boundary line goes up and down. General area on page 334. This is the area of the course. It covers everything except for the 4 specific areas: the teen area the player's playing from, all penalty areas, all bunkers, and the putting green of the hole the player is playing. So back to our example, players on the 3rd starting play of the 3rd hole The teen area for number 3 is not part of the general area, but the teen area for, say, the 5th hole is. So if a player hits his ball, tee shot well to the right, winds up there, it can be important to know that is part of the general area. For example, what if the ball embeds in that other teen area? What if there's temporary water on that other teen area? Lets the player know how to proceed when taking relief. All right, next definition, boundary object on page 329. Artificial objects defining or showing out of bounds, such as walls, fences, stakes, and railings, from which free relief is not allowed. Now, this includes any base or post, but does not include angled supports or guy wires that are attached to the wall or fence, and any gate, steps, bridge, or something similar. Boundary objects are treated as immovable, which means don't move them, even if it's a stake that you could readily pick up with 2 fingers. And boundary objects are not obstructions, meaning you're not going to get free relief from them. So don't move them, and you're not allowed free relief from them. And we'll go into that in more detail as we go through the rules. Next definition and last one is integral object on page 339. Oh, and by the way, obviously, we're with page numbers, as I'm sure everyone's figured out, we're using the official guide as our reference for all that. An integral object is an artificial object defined by the committee as part of the challenge of playing the course from which free relief is not allowed. So best example of that is the road behind the 17th green at the old course at St. Andrews. That is part of the strategy and risk of playing that hole, knowing that if you hit your ball over that green onto the road, you have to play the ball from the road. You do not get free relief from it. Integral objects are treated as immovable, but if part of an integral object, such as a gate or a door, meets the definition of a movable obstruction, then it's treated as a movable obstruction and may be moved. So now back to the rule itself, Rule 2. Purpose of the rule introduces the basic things players should know about the course, the defined areas, the different types of objects and conditions that the player will encounter during their round. Then this final paragraph is very useful because it helps put in perspective why we're bothering learning all this. And that is, it's important to know the area of the course where the ball lies and the status of any interfering objects and conditions, because they often affect the player's options for playing the ball or taking relief. For example, if the player's ball lies in a penalty area, and let's say the ball is embedded in the ground, does the player get free relief? No. But if the ball is embedded in its own pitch mark in the general area, does the player get free relief? Yes. So the question as to whether the player gets free relief depends as to which area of the course the ball lies. So that's just one example of why it's so useful. And then later on, for example, under 16, Dan's going to go through the relief rules, and you'll see there's one procedure for taking relief in the general area, one for taking relief in a bunker, another procedure for taking relief on the putting green. So it's important to know where the ball lies, because that will dictate what your rights are and what your procedure is. Rule 2.1, golf's played on a course whose boundaries are set by the committee. Rule 2.2, defined areas of the course. We talked about the 5 areas, starting with the general area, which covers the vast majority of the course, and it's called the general area because it covers most of the course. And it also includes every type of ground and growing or attached objects found in that area. So typical golf course, what's included in the general area: fairways, rough, any unmown rough, trees, bushes, cart paths, shelters, things like that. Those are usually going to be in the general area. Now, for specific areas, talk about the teeing area the player's using, all penalty areas on the course, all bunkers on the course, and the putting green of the hole the player is playing. Those are the specific areas that have some specific rights and procedures. Now, what happens when a player's ball seemingly lies in more or touches more than one of these areas? The player needs to know which rule will govern, because that will determine how the player will proceed. So if part of the ball is both in the general area and one of the 4 specific areas, then it's treated as lying in that specific area. So for example, ball hit your tee shot toward a red penalty area. The ball touches the red penalty area line, but it's also just in the rough in the general area. So it also touches the general area. Where is the ball? Well, this says it's treated as lying in that specific area, meaning the penalty area. So that player's ball is in the penalty area, even though it also touches the general area. Now, what happens if you have 2 of those 4 specific areas involved? Then the ball is treated as lying in the specific area that comes first in this order: penalty area, bunker, putting green. So you could have a situation where, with so-called beach bunkers, where the sand just goes into the penalty area, ball touches the bunker, ball touches the red penalty area line. Where is the ball? Well, you look at this list of these 3 items. Since penalty area comes first, that ball is treated as lying in the penalty area. So rule 2.3, objects and conditions. Certain rules give free relief from interference by certain objects and conditions, such as loose impediments, movable obstructions, and abnormal course conditions. But there is no free relief from boundary objects or integral objects that interfere with play. No play zones. No play zone is part of either an abnormal course condition or a penalty area. Play is not allowed there and it could be for several reasons. Could be for environmental reasons, could be for safety reasons. And a player must take relief if their ball is in the no play zone, or the ball is outside it, but the no play zone, for example, what's growing in the no play zone interferes with their area of intended stance or area of intended swing. And we'll see in rules 16 and 17, how the player will go about taking relief there. So that is rule 2, pretty straightforward rule there, but still, it sets the stage and emphasizes why we need to know the areas of the course. Any questions on that? Yeah, Phil.
Under no play zones, there's no penalty statement for playing from a no play zone.
A question is, there's no penalty statement for playing from a no play zone. If you play from a no play zone, you've simply played from the wrong place. You've played from where you're not allowed to play from, and get the general penalty. All right, nothing else. Dan, I had 2 short rules. Dan's got 2 big rules, rules 3 and 4, and then I'll finish up with rule 5. What do you think? Should we go through at least part of 3 and then take a break? Or yeah, let's at least go through part of that. All right, and here's Dan still here.
All right, we're going to turn now to Rule 3, starting on page 35. Let's go through the purpose statement. Rule 3 covers the 3 central elements of all golf. Golf is played either as match play or stroke play. It's played either as an individual or with a partner, such as 4-ball or foursomes, and it's scored either gross or net. Let's talk about 3.1, and then we'll go through a couple of the definitions. 3.1, Match play and regular stroke play are very different forms of play. The way to think of match play is that you have 18 one-hole contests, and when you think of stroke play, you have one 18-hole contest. Most of the rules applied are the same, but certain rules are going to be different, particularly the penalty statements. Match play, it's always going to be loss of hole. It would otherwise be a two-stroke penalty. Forms of play, rules 21 covers other forms of play. John will be talking about that. Stableford, maximum score, par bogey. Most of you know in the WSGA, Stableford is a stable of the senior tour. And it is a form of stroke play, although certain of the stroke play rules don't apply, particularly the scoring rules. 3.1b, how players compete. We all know this. It's either individuals or as sides. Rules 1 through 20 are written, and in Rule 25, they use the term player all the time. And we're going to see when we get to the foursomes and four ball that the term player is usually going to include their partner. But when you see a rule 1 through 20, when it says the partner should do this or the player should do this, we're usually referring to both, but not always. In competitions involving partners, 23 and 22 and 23 apply. And in team competitions, that's Rule 24. It's a very short rule. Team competitions are not the same as sides. Team competitions, normally you see it in high school and college, NCAAs, WIAAs, in which it's Verona versus Middleton, and you score based on those, the teams. 3.1c, gross or net, not much to know there. I think we all know that. If it's a gross score, you're not applying the handicaps. If it's a handicap event, then you do apply the handicaps. One thing to keep in mind, and we're going to see this as we go through match play and stroke play, is handicaps in stroke play are not applied to the hole. They are applied at the end of the round. So if you shoot an 80 and your handicap is 8, you don't apply it to specific holes. You simply get a 72 for that round. Match play, if you're getting 8 penalty strokes, handicap strokes, you apply them on the particular hole that the handicap index chart, which is typically on the scorecard, instructs you to do. So let's talk about match play. There are a couple of definitions. The first is match play itself, page 345. Match play, a form of play where a player or side plays directly against an opponent or opposing side in head-to-head match of 1 or more rounds. A player or side wins a hole in match by completing the holes in the fewest strokes. The match is won when a player or side leads the opponent or opposing side by more holes than remain. And when we go through match play, we're going to see that there's a couple of other ways that you can win. Match play can be played as a singles match where one player plays directly against one opponent, a 3-ball match, or a foursome or 4-ball match. A 3-ball match, the only time you're ever going to see it is on the national exam, and that's in a competition in which a side of 2 players plays their best ball against a side of 1 other player, and that's a so-called 3-ball. Let's look at opponent on 352. Not much there. The person a player competes against in a match, the term opponent applies only in match play. So if you see a question on the national exam that says an opponent did this or an opponent did this, by definition, it is a match play event, not a stroke play event. There is no opponent in stroke play. All right, let's look at match play and its purpose statement. Match play has specific rules, particularly about concessions and giving information about the number of strokes taken, because the player and opponent, and these are the three keys, compete solely against each other on every hole, can see each other's play, and can protect their own interests. So no one cares what happens in the match other than the two people or possibly the four people that are playing. So we're not concerned with such things as holding out and so forth. We have concessions that can deal with that. Results of a hole or a match. Winning a hole. There's three ways to win a hole. A player may win it by completing the hole in fewer strokes. Obviously, that's the most common. The opponent concedes the hole, or the opponent gets the general penalty, such as loss of hole. An example of that would be you're playing and your opponent touches the sand in the bunker with the practice swing in the bunker. Well, that's a loss of hole penalty. If the opponent's ball in motion needs to be holed to tie the hole and the ball is deliberately deflected or stopped, and there's no reasonable chance, emphasis on the word reasonable chance, that it can be holed, the result of the hole has been decided. I think of this as the Jordan Spieth rule. There was a Ryder Cup a number of years ago in which the opponent putted, the ball rolled past the hole. It was a downhill putt. The ball had to go in the hole in order to tie the hole. It didn't go in. It was continuing to roll. Jordan Spieth then stopped it and knocked it back. I believe at the time the rule was different, and thus it was a loss of hole penalty for deliberately moving somebody else's ball. We now have this in the rules. And again, the easiest way for me to think about this is I envision Jordan Spieth doing that, and I say, that's not a penalty. Why? Because there's no reasonable chance that that ball could have gone in the hole. Tying a hole. A hole is tied, and I think we don't say all square much anymore. We talk about ties. When the player and the opponent complete the hole in the same number of strokes, and the player and the opponent agree that the hole can be tied, with a caveat. This is allowed only after at least one of the players has made a stroke. How does this ever come up? Well, it came up in a WSGA event. It was the fourth hole at Hidden Glen. We had two players in a match, very high handicap players. They could not get the ball onto the green on the fourth hole at Hidden Glen. We had a rules official there. I believe it was none other than Doug Fry, but I could be wrong, who then approached the two people and said, if you want to call the match, the hole tied, you can. The players were delighted. They picked up the hole and they went directly to the fifth hole, very happy that they were done with the water hole at the fourth hole at Hidden Glen.
And improved our pace of play.
Did.
Yeah.
Winning a match. A player wins a match when the player leads the opponent by more holes than remain to be played. That's the standard. You're 4 up with 3 holes to go. The player concedes the match. This can happen at the turn. You're 9 down. You're right at the clubhouse and you say, well, how many holes am I going to go before I lose? I don't want to walk out to 12, lose on 12, and then walk back. I concede the match. And lastly, opponent is disqualified. Notice that this penalty is not disqualified from a hole, which is loss of hole. This is disqualified from the match. An example could be that you're extremely upset with your opponent and you take it upon yourself to take your 7-iron out of the bag and you whack them over the head. That is probably subject to disqualification, and that's the end of the match. Extending a tied match. What is interesting about this provision is that there is a default written into the rules themselves. This is different than stroke play. If a match is tied after the final hole, the match is extended 1 hole at a time until there is a winner. The holes are played in the same order as the round unless the committee sets a different order. So you finish 18, you're tied. It's not a question of whether the match has to go on. Yes, it does, unless the committee says otherwise. You continue to play. Are there times in which the committee will set a different order? And the answer is yes, we do that in many WSGA events where the WSGA, we don't own any courses, we're guests at courses. And in the final couple of matches, there may be members playing on the course, there may be public playing on the course. And so you often don't have the choice of going to 18, going back to 1. So you may have the players play 18 repeat because that's the hole that is opened, and on you go. When result is final, the result of a match becomes final in the way stated by the committee. So there is no default on how the match becomes final. The WSGA has on the bottom of its hard card that it becomes final in match play when the committee has approved the results as posted on the public scoreboard. The public scoreboard normally is up at the clubhouse, and Jeff or Thomas or Drew or whoever then finds out that John beat Gary by 4 and 3, and then they write it on the official scoreboard. That's when it becomes final. This becomes important because you could have a situation in which somebody wins 4 and 3, they're walking back to the clubhouse, they look in the other guy's bag, they see he's got 15 clubs and blah, blah, blah. You can then make a claim because the match is not final. Let's talk about concessions, 3.2B. There's 2 things to know about concessions. If you can do it, and then how you do it. A player may concede the opponent's next stroke, hole, or match. Before we go through these, the way to think about this is you can always make a concession prospectively. You cannot make a concession retroactively. So if something is done, if the match is over, you can't say, I concede to you. If the match is not over, you're going to be able to concede if you so choose. So let's go through these. Conceding the next hole. This is allowed anytime before the opponent's next stroke is made. The opponent has then completed the hole with the stroke that includes the conceded stroke, and the ball may be removed. A concession made while the opponent's ball is still in motion after the previous stroke applies to the opponent's next stroke unless the ball is holed, in which case it's irrelevant. So you putt from 10 feet, the ball is rolling towards the hole, you're pretty sure it's not going in, and you say, John, that I concede the next stroke. I concede the stroke. Well, the ball goes in, it doesn't make any difference, it's in. If it doesn't, then that next stroke is conceded. Conceding a hole. This is allowed anytime before the hole is completed. Again, we're talking about applying them prospectively, including before the player starts the hole. There's an interesting clarification. I guess John didn't mention this, but let's be clear on this. We no longer have interpretations in the rules of golf. The only thing we have are the rules themselves and clarifications. The old things that we used to call interpretations have now been renamed clarifications. So we'll be talking about clarifications. It says anytime before the hole is completed, you can have a situation in which the player, take my favorite course at Oconomowoc, the 13th hole, you hit your second shot up on the green, you're pretty sure it was a good shot. You're not quite sure because it's an elevated green. Your opponent hits his shot and it lands a foot away. And you get up there and you don't see your ball and you see your opponent's ball a foot away. And you say, oh, I don't even know where it is. I concede. The opponent goes to pick up the ball a foot away. He sees another ball in the hole and it's your ball. You have won the hole with the 2. So the fact that you then concede is irrelevant. It's an invalid concession. Why? Because once the hole is conceded, once the hole is completed, you cannot concede the hole. A player and opponent are not allowed to agree to concede holes to each other for the purpose of shortening the match. So it's the specific purpose that is being not allowed. Can you concede a hole? Yes. You can get to the fourth hole at Hidden Glen, and you can say, I'm playing against John. He's the best iron player. I can't hit mine straight. John, there's no point in even hitting this shot. I can't beat you. I concede, and then you go to the fifth hole. How concessions are made. Any of our match play events for the WSGA, the starter is very careful to tell the people, make sure your concessions are verbal, make sure they're clear so that the other player knows that you have made a concession. If the opponent lifts their ball in breach of a rule because of a reasonable misunderstanding that the player's statement or actions was a concession of the next stroke, a hole, a match, there is no penalty and the ball must be replaced on its original spot. A couple things about this. It has to be a reasonable misunderstanding of something that the player said. We had an interesting situation with Suzanne Pedersen. I believe it was the Solheim Cup. And the American player hit her ball, probably stopped a foot from the hole. Susan Pedersen didn't say anything, and the other player picked up her ball. Well, when she picks up her ball, it's a one-stroke penalty. She didn't mark it, obviously, and she has to put it back. Susan Pedersen was sort of criticized for saying she should have conceded it. Well, she didn't concede it. Maybe she would have when the player got up there. But the point is, there is no concession until the opponent clearly says that ball's good. An example of a reasonable misunderstanding could be a situation when I putt from 30 feet and the ball's getting pretty close to the hole, and Gary says, good putt. And I hear the word good, it stops a foot away and I pick it up. And then Gary says, no, I didn't say the next putt's good. I said the previous one was a good putt. Is that a reasonable misunderstanding? I think so. There's no penalty. You put the ball back and then you finish the hole. The other way this can come about is if a caddy tries to make a concession. There's a clarification 3.2b parent 2/1. Caddies do not have the authority to make a concession. What happens if the caddy does that? Nothing. There's no penalty to the caddy. The concession isn't good. But if the player picks up his ball in anticipation of or upon hearing the caddy from the other side say, that's good, it would likely be a reasonable misunderstanding. The player would then be able to put the ball back, and then they would continue on from there. All right, next section on match play, handicaps in handicap match play. Players and opponents should, doesn't say required, it says should, tell each other their handicaps before the match. If a player declares a wrong handicap, either before or during the match, and does not correct it before the opponent makes the next stroke, then we're going to decide whether it's too high or too low and decide how to proceed. If the handicap that you declare is too high, the player is then disqualified. If the handicap is too low, you then have to play off of that handicap. Interesting twist here is what happens if you don't declare a handicap. And this is very common. If you have an event at your club, you may have a pro, the assistant pro, trying to help out the players. He comes out, he hands his card to Doug, and he hands one to Gary, and he says, okay, here it is. And Gary, you're getting 2 strokes. You're getting it on the 5th and the 7th, and then the players tee off. The player has not declared a wrong handicap. He hasn't done anything. He's just playing. And then you're going to have to figure out what to do. They may never discover it's the wrong handicap, and that's it. If they do discover it, then they better talk to the pro about how they're going to correct it for the rest of that round. Meaning of handicap, the rules now make it clear what handicap means. 3.2c, parent 1/2. And that is on page 46, bottom page 46. If a player gives the opponent incorrect information in relation to their handicap, and this results in the player giving too few or getting too many strokes, the player is disqualified. For example, a player tells an opponent an incorrect handicap index, a course handicap, or a playing handicap, blah, blah, blah. So in other words, if you're asked what your index is and you give the wrong one, you've given the wrong information. If you're asked what is your course handicap and you give the wrong one, if you're asked the playing handicap. Now, with the GIN system that we have in Wisconsin, this is inconceivable to me that this happens. You go to the first tee, what do? You pull out your cell phone and you say, Gary Wild, and you type it in. It pulls it up and it says, and then you put in your name. And the GIN says, Gary's course handicap is 12 because you put in the right tees is the black tees. Dan's is 6, so Dan gets 6 strokes. And then the GIN system does you something even better. It actually does the subtracting for you. So you don't even have to subtract 6 from 12. The GIN system does it for you and says that in this situation, you get 6 strokes. So the rule is what the rule is, but hard for me to understand in 2023 how these handicap miscalculations continue to apply. Holes where handicap strokes apply. Handicap strokes are given by hole, and the lower net score is the wins the hole in a tied match. Handicap strokes are given by hole. One thing I did want to bring up, what happens if you are entitled to 1 handicap, you declare correctly that you're entitled to, or you declare incorrectly that you're entitled to 2 handicaps, and you only should have gotten 1, but the handicap holes are 12 and 18, and you haven't played those. It doesn't make any difference once you're playing off the wrong handicap by declaring it. The fact that that hole has not come into you have not played that hole is irrelevant. And the reason is because your strategy is based on how many strokes you're going to get. And you may be playing strategically such that at such and such a hole, you know that you have a good chance of winning it. So even if you don't play that hole, the hole is affected, you still are going to be disqualified. That is a clarification 3.2 C1 parent 1. All right, let's talk about responsibilities of the player and the opponent. Number 1, telling opponent about number of strokes taken. At any time during the play of a hole or after the hole is complete, the opponent may ask for the number of strokes and the player has taken. This is to allow the opponent to decide how to play. In other words, it's a strategy question. When asked for the number of strokes taken, or when giving that information without being asked, the player must give the right number of strokes. A player who fails to respond is going to get the loss of hole penalty. So you can't just say, if you're playing the hole, when the opponent asks you, what do you lie? None of your business, I'll tell you when we finish the hole. You can't do that. Stroke play you can, but not in match play. If they ask, you have to tell them. A player who fails to respond to the opponent's request is treated as giving the wrong number of strokes taken. This is always on the national exam. And notice that the trigger point for when you need to correct the failure to give the information is not when you make your next stroke, but when the opponent makes the next stroke. In other words, you must correct it or give the correct information before the opponent makes their next stroke. All right, wrong number of strokes given while playing a hole. The player must give the right number of strokes taken before the opponent makes the next stroke. Wrong number of strokes given after hole complete. The player must give the right number of strokes taken before either player makes a stroke to begin another hole or takes similar action for the final hole of the match before the result of the match is final. So, and let's go with the exception. There's no penalty if there's no effect on the result of the hole. If the player gives the wrong number of strokes taken after a hole is completed, but this does not affect the opponent's understanding of whether the hole was won, lost, or tied, there is no penalty. Example, I finished the first hole, I'm playing against John. John says, what did you have? And I said, I had a 4. And John says, well, I had a 7, you won the hole. Then we get to another hole. I said, well, wait a minute, I actually had a 5. It has no effect on the outcome because a 5 is going to beat a 7, so there's no problem. But what happens if on the first hole, John says, what did you have? And I say, I have a 4. John says, well, I had a 5, you win the hole. And then we get to the second hole and we're walking down the fairway. And then I said, well, wait a minute, John, I actually had a 5 on the first hole. I guess we tied it. And John says, no, we didn't tie. If you said you had a 4 and you really had a 5, you gave the wrong information, you lost the hole. So instead of being tied in that situation, I am going to be 1 down. Why? Because I gave the wrong information. Telling opponent about a penalty. When a player gets a penalty, the opponent must tell the player must tell the opponent about the penalty as soon as reasonably possible. I'd underscore that, as soon as reasonably possible, taking into account how near the player is to the opponent. So as an example, if I hit the ball on the right side of the fairway and John hits his to the left and he's walking down the left, I may actually find my ball. It may be directly behind a tree. I have to take an unplayable ball relief. I drop it within 2 club lengths. I play it out to the fairway. Meanwhile, John is over on the left side doing whatever he's doing and he's hitting his ball. I don't have to tell him about that until as soon as reasonably possible. Reasonably possible in this situation would mean I get up to the fairway and I see John and I say, oh, by the way, I'm lying 3, not 2, because I had a penalty stroke. Notice that this applies only to a penalty stroke. If I am behind a tree in the same situation, and instead of taking a penalty stroke, I chunk my wedge about a foot, and then I hit my 3rd shot out to the fairway, I have no obligation to tell John, by the way, John, I'm lying 3. However, if John asks what you're lying, you got to tell him, I'm lying 3. And he says, 3? Yeah, well, I hit the 2nd shot about a foot, and that's the reason I'm lying 3. This requirement applies even if the player does not know about the penalty, because our players are expected to recognize when they have a breach. So you may have incurred a penalty. Maybe you touch sand in a bunker. You don't know that's a breach. You don't tell your opponent about it. You have given wrong information if you don't tell them about it as soon as possible, unless it's lost a hole. If the player fails to do so and does not correct the mistake before the opponent makes another stroke or takes a similar action, such as conceding it, the player gets the general penalty. Exception, this is a common sense exception. If the opponent knows that you've had a penalty, you aren't obligated to then tell them. The obvious example would be you hit your ball into a red penalty area, your opponent's standing there watching you as you take your 2 club lengths, you then drop the ball. You are not obligated to say, oh, Mr. Opponent or Mrs. Opponent, I got a penalty. It's obvious, they saw it, you don't need to say it. Knowing match score. Players are expected to know the match score. That is, whether one of them leads by a certain number of holes, also known as all square, although you never see that term anymore. If the player mistakenly agree on a match score, notice that this is saying that they mistakenly agree, they may correct the match score before either player makes a stroke to begin another hole or for the final hole before the result of the match is final. And again, this is if they mistakenly agree. If you have deliberately not told them, that is not a mistake. It's not corrected in time, the wrong match score becomes the actual match score. Does that mean that you can actually agree innocently that somebody is 3 up when they were actually 4 up? And the answer is yes. If you agree that somebody is 3 up and there's no quote fraud involved, or if you haven't misled anybody, there's just a misunderstanding. And then once you tee off on the next hole, that's the match score. You then can't go back. Now, as a practical matter in common play, it's often say, well, I think it's on, and then they correct it, even if they don't do it in time. Protecting own rights and interests. A player in a match should protect their own rights and interests under the rules. If the player knows or believes the opponent has breached a rule that has a penalty, the player may choose whether or not to act on the breach. But if the player and the opponent agree not to apply the rule or the penalty, they know applies, and either of those then starts the round, they're both disqualified. This is a nice change from a few years ago. The question of agreement was always kind of loosey-goosey. And we now have a very nice clarification that tells us how we do the questions of whether there is an agreement. Remember, the rule says you can always overlook somebody's breach. So if a player puts a divot back in the divot hole and you say he's not that good of a player, he can't hit it anyways, you can overlook it. What you can't do is you can't agree to make an agreement to overlook the rules. The agreement is on page 49. This is clarification 3.2D parent 4/1. And this is a nice addition to the rules. A player in a match who knows or believes that their opponent has breached a rule that has a penalty may choose not to act on the breach, but the player and opponent may not agree to ignore a breach or penalty they know applies. And here's the key. For there to be an agreement, both players need to be involved in the decision to ignore the breach or the penalty. So what does that mean? That means is if we're going from one hole to another and I look in John's bag and I said, John, you got 15 clubs. That's, we're going to get to this in a minute, but that's going to be an adjustment penalty. And John says, yeah, I guess you got me. Well, there's no agreement. I'm allowed to apply the penalty, or I'm allowed to say, but John, I don't care. You're not that good. You keep the 15 clubs. I'm overlooking it. No problem there. What is a problem is if I then say to John, you got 15 clubs, and John says, well, I know that's a penalty and you know that's a penalty, but I think it'd be poor sportsmanship for you to apply the penalty. What do you think about that, Dan? And I kind of hem and haw and I say, oh, okay, I'll tell you what. I won't apply the penalty, but you take out the 14th club and you take out one other club, and then we'll call it even. Now, both players have been involved in the decision to overlook the breach. The rest of that interpretation or clarification goes through 2 examples in which it's the player's sole discretion, and 2 examples, which I just went through, in which both players are involved in that decision. That is match play.
Answer these 2 questions
Uh,
that are
Question online. In handicap match play, can the players decide where strokes are taken or given? If not, which rule prevents this? I would say they cannot, because they are assuming that they know that this is not permitted. They have breached a rule. It is the committee's. It is the committee's job to set where the handicap holes, the index holes, are decided. Agree with that, John? Okay.
32C2,
And we have a comment that it's 323.
32C2.
32C2.
Responsible
And the
based on
next
stroke
question?
index allocation set by the committee.
All right, next question. A is 2 up playing 17 hole. A's ball moves and replaced. Doesn't tell B, finishes hole and wins match 3-1. Reports result to the committee, match is final. At lunch, B finds out about B's breach. What can be done? This is going to depend, and we're going to cover this in Rule 20. And it's going to depend on whether the player knew that they had breached the rules before the competition was final. And in the question posed, it says the match is final. So the match is final, the match is final, unless there is, quote, fraud. That's my term, not the rules term. And we'll go over that in Rule 20. Yeah, Phil, go ahead.
Okay, so the scenario that you described before of two players have teed off on the hole after completing the previous hole, and they got the information wrong about the number of strokes taken, but they don't know that they can't agree to adjust the match because I mean the way the rules are written, the agreed upon, the original agreed upon status of the match stands. But they're walking down and they realize that somebody had given wrong information. They don't know it's against the rules to change it. They could change the status of the match because they're not agreeing to modify the rules, correct?
Yeah, the question is, anytime you have an agreement in match play, there's never going to, I think this is a clear statement, there's never going to be a disqualification if the players do not know that what they have done is a breach of the rules. Often people play in a match and they say, well, why don't we just concede putts within 3 feet? And they play the match, they concede every putt within 3 feet, they turn the score in, John wins 5-4, that's the end of it. If the players know that it is a breach of the rules to do that, then the players can be disqualified. But once the match is final and there's no knowledge that you have an agreement, that's the end of it. All right, let's look at Rule 3.3, which is stroke play.
You want to take a break?
No, let's finish 3. 3.3, purpose of rule. Stroke play has specific rules, particularly for scorecards and holing out, because each player competes against all the other players in the competition, and all players need to be treated equally under the rules. After the round, the player and the marker who keep the player's score must certify the player's score for each hole. It is right, and return the scorecard. Fundamentally different concept than in match play, because here you have 150 odd other people who care deeply whether you have holed out, whether you did concede this, whether you do that. So everybody has an interest, and it's your obligation in stroke play to make sure that everybody follows the rules. Let's look at 2 definitions. Page 359, scorecard. The document where a player's score for each hole is entered in stroke play. The scorecard may be in any paper or electronic form approved by the committee that allows, and here's the 2 things, the player's score to be entered for each hole, and the marker and the player to certify the scores either by physical signature or by a method of electronic certification. Electronic certification is a fancy term for pushing the right button. That's the signature. Most of you know that in WSGA events, we use electronic scoring. The paper cards are given out as a courtesy, I guess, but the actual scoring is done online. All high school events, at least the state high school events, championships, are all done electronically. And you still have some groups and organizations. I noticed the Badgers women still use the paper scorecard. They don't use electronic. Why? I don't know, but that's their right. Next one to look at is stroke play. Next page. A form of play where a player or side competes against all other players or sides in the competition. Regular forms of stroke play. A player or side score for a round is the total number of strokes, including talent strokes and penalty strokes. The winner is the side who completes in the fewest number of strokes. All right, 3.3. Winner in stroke play. The player who completes the round in the fewest number of strokes. Notice the blue language right at the bottom. It says, see committee procedures, section 5A, parent 6. The terms of the competition should say how ties will be decided. Unlike match play, in stroke play, there is no default in the rules. So it's up to the committee to make that determination. Sometimes the committee will say there will be a playoff immediately following and leave it kind of vague because the committee may not know where the playoff is going to be. And there's a number of reasons for that. One of which is because of the course, there may be general play following the group. And again, you may be forced to use holes 17 or 18. But anyways, that is up to the committee to make that determination. You don't automatically go to the first hole when you finish in stroke play. Scoring in stroke play. The player's score is kept on the scorecard by the marker who is either identified by the committee or chosen by the player in a way approved by the committee. National test, you always have the question of the marker in match play. There'll be some variation of that. And of course, the question is always false because there is not a marker in match play. A marker is a stroke play concept. So what are the marker's responsibilities? After each hole during the round, the marker should, anytime you see the word should in the rule, that means that if you breach it, there's not going to be a penalty. If it says must and you breach that, then you're going to get a penalty. Here it says should confirm with the player the number of strokes on that hole, including strokes made and penalty strokes, and enter that on the gross score on the scorecard. When the round is ended, the marker must, so here we have a must for the marker, must certify the whole scores on the scorecard. If the player had more than one marker, each marker must certify the score for those holes where they were the marker. But if one of the markers saw the player play all of the holes, that marker may certify the scores for all of the holes. That's a change for 2023. And the old one is that the marker, if you had two markers, the first marker would have to certify holes 1 through 15, and then the second marker would have to certify 16 through 18. Again, I think this is a nice change. What I find fascinating about this is it says the marker after each hole should confirm the scores. If you've ever done any scoring, you're sitting in the scoring tent and the player comes in and they're there with the cards and one guy says to the other, oh, by the way, what'd you get on holes 8, 9, and 10? And the guy says, oh, I had a 4, 5, and 6. And so he writes 4, 5, and 6. Well, that's technically okay, but the rule says you should confirm it after each hole, and you're not doing a very good job of being a marker if you ask the player 9 holes later, what did he get on 3 previous holes? Top of page 43, a marker may refuse to certify a player's hole scores that the marker believes is wrong. In such case, a committee will need to consider the available information and make a decision. I don't know if this has happened at the WSGA in recent years, but in past, there have been serious issues where a marker just says, no, I'm not going to certify it. Basically accusing the other side of cheating or being less than honest. It is the marker's obligation. It is not their requirement to certify it if they refuse to certify it. In other words, the marker has the ability to simply say no. And then it's up to the committee. And typically what the committee would do is if it's a threesome, they'd ask the other 2 players, and then you do the best you can to verify that the score that the player says he got. If it ultimately turns out that there's only two players and the player says I had a 4 and his partner and or would be stroke play his fellow competitor says you had a 5, it's pretty hard to say that the player is wrong if you have no other information. But if you're the committee, you have them both come in and you say, well, why did you think he had a 5? Well, I saw him hit this and then he chunked that other one about a foot. And then you look at the other guy and you say, did you chunk it about a foot? And if he says, absolutely not, well, then I guess on you go and you give the player the benefit of the doubt. But most of these can be resolved by interrogating the players and finding out what really happened. And you do the best you can. All right, player's responsibility. When the round has ended, the player should carefully check. Again, that's a should, no penalty. He doesn't do it. But he's got 3 musts. He must make sure that the marker certifies the whole score. He must not change a whole score entered by the marker, except with the marker's agreement or the committee's approval. And he must certify the whole scores on the scorecard and properly return it to the committee. So what happens if you show up at the scoring and your marker left? Well, it's your obligation to get them to certify, but there's nothing you can do if the marker has left. You then bring it to the committee's attention and you say, dear Mr. Committee, my marker has left. I don't know where he is. I think my scores are accurate. And then the committee has the ability then to gather any necessary information and then to certify it. Notice that it says the player must not change the whole scores without the agreement of the marker or the committee. You can have situations in which the marker isn't there, or the player says, oh, well, this isn't right. I know I had a 5 on it, and he simply changes it on his own. If the player does that, the player is going to get disqualified unless he has talked to the marker about it and or gotten the permission of the committee. You cannot simply change the score that the marker put down, even if you think it to be wrong. You have to go through this procedure. All right, exception. There's no penalty for disqualification when the breach is due to the marker's failure to carry out responsibility. So we just went through that. There is no penalty if the committee finds the player's breach was caused by the marker's failure to carry out the responsibility, such as the marker leaving with the player's scorecard or without certifying the whole score, so long as that this was done beyond the player's control. One other thing that they'll always ask on the national exam is you say to your marker, I had a 5 on this hole rather than the 4, and then the marker says, oh yeah, that's right, and then he crosses it out and writes 4. The question always is, and the player and marker must then initial the scorecard. The answer is false. There is no additional obligation to do anything other than to put your signature on or certify the whole scores. There's no obligation to put a little check mark by a certain hole that has been changed. Committee procedure, Section 8, Model Local Rule L1. This is a very interesting new model local rule. Again, it's not a change in the rules per se, but it is a model local rule. It reduces the penalty for returning a scorecard without whole scores being certified. The WSGA, as of January 1, has now adopted that on their hard card. Let's take a quick look at it. It's on page 520. Model Local Rule L1, purpose. 3.3b2 imposes a penalty of disqualification when the whole scores on the scorecard have not been certified by the player or the marker or both. Here's the model local rule. 3.3B2 is modified in this way. If a player returns a scorecard without the whole scores being certified, either by the player, the marker, or both, the player gets the general penalty. So in other words, the player will not be disqualified if you turn in a scorecard that only has one signature or it has no signatures. There's a two-stroke penalty, but that's it. Like I said, the USGA has adopted that. The WSGA, we haven't met on that issue, and I guess we'll decide in due course whether we would adopt that or not. All right, wrong score for a hole. If a player returns a scorecard with the wrong score for any hole, it depends on whether the score is higher or lower. If the score is higher than the actual score, it is returned. It is, the hole stands. The most famous one of that was the 1968 Masters when Roberto Di Vincenzo recorded a 4 on the 17th hole when he actually had a 3, thinking that he was going to be in the playoff with Bob Goldme, only to find out that he recorded a 4, the 4 stood, and he did not make the playoff. If you record a score lower than actually scored, then you're going to be disqualified. Here's the exception. Failure to include unknown penalties. Excuse me. If one or more of the players' hole scores are lower than they actually score because they exclude one or more penalty strokes that the player did not know about before returning the scorecard, the player is not disqualified. Instead, if the mistake is found before the close of the competition, the committee will simply revise it and give the player the stroke. So as an example, you touch the sand in the bunker in a practice swing, you don't know that that is a breach. You turn in your round of 86, you should have had an 88. It's discovered before the competition is closed, but after you have certified the whole scores, then you're not going to be disqualified. This exception does not apply when the excluded penalty is disqualification. An example of that would be you play a wrong ball from the middle of the rough on the 3rd hole, and you fail to correct it, you putt out, you tee off on 4. That is a disqualification penalty. Even though you don't know about it, it nevertheless is going to be a disqualification. Top of page 45, player not responsible for showing handicap on score or adding up scores. This is a wonderful change to the rules. We're now putting the handicap requirement to show the handicap, putting that responsibility on the committee, not on the player. There was, I think, some interpretation or clarification over the last few years that some of the committees were working under, but now it's in the rules itself. There is no requirement for a player's handicap to be shown on the scorecard or for the player to add up their own scores. If the player returns a scorecard in which they have a mistake in showing or applying a handicap, there is no penalty. Once the committee receives the scorecard, the player at the end of the round, the committee is responsible for adding up the score and calculating the handicaps. And this is really a good change because it is the committee, WSGA, what does the committee do? Jeff or Drew or Thomas, they go to the website, they pull up the thing, they go to Jim, they say, okay, there's Dan, he's a 5'2", he's a playing handicap, course handicap is 6, but we're only going to play at 90%, so he's only going to get a 5, and so then they write 5 on that, and that's what you do. That's not my responsibility, that's the committee's responsibility. Last thing in Rule 3 is 3.3C, failure to hole out. A player must hole out at each hole in a round. If the player fails to hole out at any hole, the player must correct that mistake before making a stroke to begin another hole or for the final hole of the round before returning the scorecard. If the mistake is not corrected in time, the player is disqualified. This is the first of the 5 must corrects. If you're gonna take the national exam, you gotta know the 5 must corrects. It's failure to hole out, it's teeing in front of the tee markers, it's hitting a wrong ball, it's playing from wrong place, serious breach, and it's failure to play alternately in alternate shot. Any questions on rule 3? Let me say one more thing about hole out. John's going to talk about the definition of hole, but hole out means the ball must be in the circle, all of the ball below the hole, and it must be at rest. If the ball is still circling the bottom of the hole and the player picks it out, that is nevertheless considered at rest, so there's no penalty. And there is one nice exception: if the ball is leaning against the flagstick and the flagstick is in the hole, any part of the ball below the hole is treated as being holed. Again, John will go over that in whenever you go over it. All right, any questions on 16? I'm sorry, on 3.
You're 3 weeks ahead of yourself.
Yeah, yeah, 10 minutes is fine. Take a 10-minute break and then we'll be back.
Gee, John, we actually get this done today. We're back. I'm going to handle one question on question 3. There was an online question. Can the committee mandate the use of only electronic scorecards during the round? The answer to that is yes. The way you remember it is the committee basically can do whatever it wants, and the committee's decision is final. All right, under Rule 4. Let's look at the purpose statement of Rule 4. Page 53, the player's equipment. Purpose of the rule. Rule 4 covers the equipment that the player may use during a round based on the principle that golf is a challenging game in which success should depend on the player's judgment, skill, and abilities. The player must use conforming clubs and balls, is limited to 14 clubs, and is restricted in the use of other equipment that gives artificial help to their play. Rule 4 is divided into 3 parts: clubs, then balls, then other equipment. Let's look at the definition of equipment on page 333. The definition is reasonably simple. Used to be complicated. Now it's relatively simple. Anything used, worn, held, or carried by the player or the player's caddy, that's their equipment. Objects used for the care of the course, such as rakes, other things of that sort, are equipment only while they are being used. Objects other than clubs carried by someone else for the player are not equipment, even if they belong to the player. So in that last example, especially in the high school events, you always get the parents who are carrying umbrellas and rain gear and food and such for their player. That is not the player's equipment. The other question that comes up with equipment is, what about the ball, a ball marker or a tee? Yes, those are the player's equipment. So if the player marks his 2 club length dropping area with a tee, that is the player's equipment. When we get to rule 14, we're going to see whether there is or is not a problem when you hit your own equipment when you drop the ball. The last definition I want to go over is equipment rules. You can see it says the specifications and other regulations for club balls, blah, 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 that are found at usg.org/equipment rules. The thing to keep in mind is that if you download the USGA rules apps, all the equipment rules are on there. And it's one of the things on the bottom of the screen. It says equipment rules. You check on it. It sends you right there. It's very easy to look through. So I would encourage you, if you got any questions about the equipment rule, to look at the USGA rules app. All right, clubs. 4.1. There are 3 parts to 4.1. Clubs allowed in making a stroke, the 14 club rule, and then taking the procedure for taking a club out of play. In making a stroke, a player must use a club that conforms to the requirements of the equipment rule when it is new or when its playing characteristics have been changed in any way. And we're going to see some exceptions to that in just a minute. The phrase "in making a stroke" means in making a stroke that counts in the score. So if you hit a ball that you, with your tee shot, that you think may be out of bounds, and you've hit it with a conforming club, and then you say, well, I'm going to be a little more careful this time, so I'm going to hit my provisional ball, and you use a Medicus, which is a non-conforming club, and you go up there and you find your original ball, you saved yourself a disqualification penalty as well as a 2-stroke, as well as a stroke and distance. If you don't find your ball, then the ball hit with the Medicus is the ball in play. You've not played with a conforming club and you're disqualified. There is a new phrase in the rules for 2023, and it is playing characteristics. There is an internal definition. The playing characteristics of a club are any part, feature, or property that affects how the club performs or aids in alignment, including but not limited to weighing, lie, loft, alignment features, and permissible external attachments. That is extremely broad, and basically, if you do anything to your club, you've probably changed the playing characteristics. But there are not necessarily problems with that in certain circumstances. So let's look at 2. Use, repair, or replacement of a club damaged during a round. If a conforming club is damaged during a round or while play is stopped under Rule 5.78, except in cases of abuse, we'll come back to that, the player may repair or replace it with another club. So this is a change in the rules, although not much of a change in outcome because the WSGA had adopted model local rule G9, which had permitted the replacement of clubs. But it does make one small change, the rule itself, because in the cases of abuse, you are not able to repair the club. Top of page 54. But no matter what the nature or cause of the damaged club is treated as conforming for the rest of the round, but not during a playoff and stroke play, which is a new round. For the rest of the round, the player may continue to make strokes with the damaged club, or, except in cases of abuse, repair the club or place it with another club. So you hit your driver, it snaps in two, and now you got a driver that's 2 feet long. You can continue playing with that. If you abuse the club by banging it into the ground, you can continue, and you damage it, you can continue to use that for the round. What you can't do is you can't repair a club that has been abused during the round. That's the slight change for 2023. What is the definition of repair? Well, there isn't a definition of repair. We have a clarification that instead of giving a definition, gives 2 examples. And that is on page 64. Meaning of repair. And then it goes on. Examples of repair include replacing lead tape that fell off during a round, or tightening clubs with an adjustable mechanism that come loose during the round, but not adjusting the club to a different setting. That's the 2 examples of repair. So if you take your club and you have an adjustable feature and you bang it into the ground and the adjustable feature moves or changes or whatever, you can't repair it. What does that mean? That means you cannot reach down and screw it back into its correct spot because you have abused it. If, however, during a stroke, you hit the ball and the adjustable feature comes loose, then you can repair it, which means you must put it back to the spot that it was in. You can't put it into a different spot. You have to put it into the same spot. If the player replaces a damaged club with another club, the player must take the damaged club out of play before making another stroke using the procedure in 4.1c. And we're going to go over that. This is also a change in the rules. And the change is we have a new trigger here. The old rules used to say that you had to take the damaged club out immediately. There was always a question of what does immediately mean? Now we have a clear trigger point. It is before making another stroke. So there you go. Damage during a round means, this is an internal definition, means any part, feature, or property of the club is changed because of any act during the round while play is stopped under 5.7, whether by the player in taking it in or out of the bag, dropping it, or leaning on it, or abusing it. So notice that your club can be damaged during the round by abuse. But a club is not damaged during the round if its playing characteristics are deliberately changed by the player, and that's going to be covered by 4.1a3. So let's look at 4.1a3. This is deliberately changing the club's playing characteristics. And it gives 2 examples. A player must not make a stroke with a club when they deliberately change that club's playing characteristics during the round by using an adjustable feature or by applying any substance. So you can't, if your driver is going too low, you can't say, well, I'm going to adjust it up to another notch and then make a stroke with it. Secondly, you can't apply a substance to the face of the club head, such as Vaseline. I don't know if that works, but in any event, you can't do it And then we're going to see in the exception that if the adjustment, if the deliberate change you make is an adjustable feature, you are allowed to restore it by putting it back to its original spot. But if the deliberate change is by adding a substance to it, you cannot undo that. So in other words, you put Vaseline on your driver, someone says you can't do it, you clean it off, you take soap and water, it's now nice and clean. That club cannot be used. Why? Because you deliberately changed it, and it does not meet the exception of one of the items that can be restored. The other item that's new for 2023, I believe this was in a clarification, it's top of page 55. A non-permissible external attachment, such as a sticker on the club, is removed from the club before the club is used to make a stroke. We had a number of instances last summer. They were clubs. Someone would get on the course, they would make a stroke with the new 9-iron, and they'd have the for sale sign on the front of the club. Is that an external attachment? Yes. And it was non-conforming, and the person would be disqualified. Now, with this provision in the rules, you can take the sticker off before you make the stroke. If you leave the sticker on, you're disqualified. The last thing under this clubs allowed is, I often get a question, in fact, I have a number of times, when someone says, well, I took the national exam or I took one of the quizzes online. And I just don't understand how it could possibly be wrong. It says the player added a foreign substance to his club on the third hole. I just know you can't do that. And then I point out to them, there is no penalty for adding or changing your clubs. The penalty only applies to making a stroke with something that has not, which was done incorrectly. So again, 4.1 is only applies to strokes made, clubs made during a stroke. So are you allowed to carry a medicus, which is a non-conforming club? Yes, you just can't make a stroke with it. It may count as part of your 14, we'll see that in a minute, but there's no penalty per se for carrying it. All right, the problem with 4.1A, if you don't make a stroke with a non-conforming club, it's pretty serious. You're done. Penalty for making a stroke and breach of 4.1A is disqualification. I mean, there's nothing else to be said. There's no penalty under this rule for merely having but not making a stroke with a non-conforming club or a club whose playing characteristics were deliberately changed. We just went over that. All right. Let's talk about the 14 club rule, and I'll set it up with a problem, and we'll discuss this as we go through the 14 club rule. John Morissette and I are playing really good golf. We both qualify for the state am. We're excited. Neither one of us has ever played in it. We're matched up together in the pairings, thanks to Jeff. And we go to the practice range, and John says, I'm really going to play well. I got a new driver this year. Here, you got to see it. And I says, well, does it conform? And John says, oh, absolutely. So I make a few practice swings, and then we look at our watch, and I say, Jesus, John, we got to go. So I take the driver and I put it in my bag, and off we go. I tee off on the first hole. I have 15 clubs. One of them is John's. John has 13 clubs and no driver. What do we do? Well, let's find out. 14 club rule. A player must not start a club, must not start a round with more than 14 clubs. Have more than 14 clubs during a round. This limit includes all clubs carried by or for the player, but it does not include any part of the broken club and separate parts such as club heads, shaft, or grips that are being carried by or for the player. So I started the round, I had 15 clubs. Sounds like I'm in breach of that rule. John only started with 13. We're going to see what he can do, if anything. Let's assume John has in his bag a separate driver head and a separate shaft. When the player becomes aware that they are in breach of this rule, the 14 club rule, the player must take the excess club or clubs out of play before making another stroke using the procedure in 4.1c. And again, the phrase before making another stroke is a slight change. It used to say immediately. If the player starts with more than 14 clubs, they may choose which club will be taken out. If the player adds excess clubs during the round, those clubs have to be taken out. So in my example, I started with 15 clubs. The club that I have to take out is John's driver. Or is it? Or can I take out any club? I can take out any club. Why? Because I didn't add that during the round. I added it before the round. After the player's round is started, if the player picks up another player's club that was left behind, or the club is mistakenly put in the player's bag, the club is not treated as one of the player's clubs. I think of this as the courtesy exception. If you're playing a course and you find somebody else's club, you don't just leave it on the course. You take some action, give it to a rules official, you put it in your cart, you put it in your bag. You can't use it, but you're not going to be treated as having added a club if you pick it up for the purposes of being a good citizen. No sharing of clubs. The player is limited to those clubs they started with or added as allowed in one. The player must not make a stroke with the club being used by anyone else who is playing on the course, even if the other player is playing in a different group. When the player becomes aware that they have breached this rule by making a stroke with another player's club, the player must take that club out of play before making another stroke. Again, the trigger is before making another stroke. The blue language talks about an exception in foursomes and four ball, always on the national exam. The question always is player, they're both the partners, player A starts with 10 clubs, player B starts with 10 clubs, they may share clubs. And the answer is no, because between them, they have more than 14, they have 20 clubs. Item 3, no replacing lost clubs. If a player starts with 14 clubs or adds clubs up to the limit and then lost a club during the round or while play is stopped, the player must not replace it with another club. So if you damage your club, you can replace it. But if you simply are careless and you leave it on the last hole, you can't replace that. Restrictions. When adding or replacing a club under the 14 club rule, the player must not unreasonably delay play. Listen to look at this one. Add or borrow any club being carried by or for any other player who is playing on the course, even if the other player is playing in a different group. Build a club from parts being carried by or for the player or any other player. When the player becomes aware that they have breached this rule, they then have to take it out of play. So, John club that I started with, I take it out of play. Can John then use that club? It's his club. No, it's not his club, because the definition of the person using the club is not the owner of the club. It's the person who is starting with or using those 14 clubs. So when I start that round with those 15 clubs under the rule, those are considered mine, even though the legal ownership of that driver may be John's. So John can't use that nice little driver for the rest of the round, and I have to take it or another club out before the end of the round.
But Dan, what if I haven't started my round yet? Can I get that from you?
Not if I've started. And that's the key. The example I gave is I started the round. So now John wants to get his, quote, his club back. You can't get a club by borrowing it from somebody else on the course.
Even not during the round?
I don't know. Do you think so?
No. That's the question. And it seems to me if I haven't started the round that I should be able to get a club from anywhere. That, you know, the restrictions, you know, shouldn't apply about borrowing in that case. But it's interesting.
He's already playing on the course.
I'm already playing on the course. Online, the question is, if I am playing on the course, but John is not playing on the course, can then John take one of my clubs that I have then discarded? John thinks the answer is yes. I was pretty sure it was no, and now I'm heading towards I'm not sure.
That's a good default. When John's involved.
We'll give that some more thought. Yes, one more question.
What if John has started, but you have not? And you decide, realize that you have his driver in your bag. Since you haven't started, can he then take that out of your bag and use it?
Yeah, the question is if John starts with 13 clubs, I, who have John's driver, have not started, can John add an extra club? Seems to me that's the same question, and that is, can you get a club from someone who is not playing on the course? And the problem with the rules is it uses the phrase, I believe the phrase is using.
Yeah, but in that case, if, it talks about, someone else playing on the course. So where, but the question is the player who has not yet started this round, do the prohibitions of Rule 4.1b apply? In the title, it's interesting because the title of the rule talks about sharing, adding, or replacing clubs during the round. The section itself, 4.1b4, doesn't talk about during a round, which is, interesting. Because intuitively, you'd think, if a player hasn't started this round and he's just assembling his clubs, should it matter where the clubs come from? But it's a question of, does the language of the rule support that?
All right, we're gonna move on. We have a question mark at least on that.
He would have figured out
Issue.
if John was gonna play first, that when he looked in his bag and you had been hitting his club, he would have figured it out before he hit it.
Except if he started on a par 3 hole and he hit a 7-iron off the first tee. That's what happened to Ian Woosen. We'll talk about that in a minute. All right, let's, it's an interesting question. We'll just leave it at that and we'll come back to it if we have time. Where were we here? Oh, let's talk about the penalty section of Rule 4.1b. This is a fascinating penalty for 3 good reasons, and we're going to go through the reasons. Player becomes aware of breach while playing the hole. The penalty is applied at the end of the hole being played. In match play, the player must complete the hole, apply the result of the hole to the match score, and then apply the penalty after the penalty to adjust the match score. Player becomes aware of breach between 2 holes. The penalty is applied at the end of the hole just completed. I believe this is the only rule still in the books where if you discover something between holes, you apply it to the previous hole or the hole just completed. So that's the first oddball with the 14 club rule. Always shows up on the national exam. The second oddity of the 14 club rule is the penalty itself. It's a match adjustment penalty in match play. It's not the same thing as a loss of hole. It's not a 2-stroke penalty. You get an adjustment penalty. At the end of the hole being played or just completed, the match score is revised by deducting 1 hole for each hole where a breach happened with a maximum of deduction of 2 holes. For an example, if a player starts with 15 clubs, becomes aware of the breach while playing the 3rd hole, and then wins that hole to go 3 up in the match, the maximum adjustment penalty applies and the player would now be 1 up. So how about this example? On the 1st hole, we finished the hole, John and I were going to the next hole. I have 15 clubs in my bag. John says, you have 15 clubs in your bag. The good news is, John says, I won the first hole. Well, what does that mean? That means nothing. It means I still get an adjustment penalty. Why? Because I breached the rule and it's an adjustment penalty. So does that mean that when we tee off on 2, that I am 2 holes down, even though we've only played 1 hole? And the answer is yes. Penalty and stroke play. 2 penalty strokes, maximum of 4. The player gets the general penalty for each hole where a breach happened, with a maximum of 4 penalty strokes. An example of that is I'm on the 16th hole. It's stroke play. I discover I have 15 clubs. I get 4 penalty strokes. Where are they added? They are added to where the breach occurred first, which is hole number 1 and hole number 2. And here's the third oddity of this. When we get to 4-ball events, we're going to see that in a 4-ball event, a partner also gets the penalty for a breach of the 14 club rule. So again, the three things to remember with the 14 club rule is that if a breach is between holes, it's applied to the last hole. The second thing is it's an adjustment penalty, not a loss of hole penalty. And the third thing is in 4-ball stroke play, the partner as well as the player is going to get the penalty. All right, procedure for taking club out of play. And then we're going to talk about, which I thought was what the other question was, before the round. So during the round, when a player becomes aware during a round that they are in breach, the player must take an action that clearly indicates each club that is being taken out of play before making the next stroke. This can be done either by declaring this to the opponent in match play or taking some other clear action. The example that comes to mind is Ian Woosen. He teed off, I think it was a British Open, but I could be wrong. And it was a par 3 starting hole. And he gets to the second teeing area and he realizes that he has 2 drivers, thus having 15 clubs. And the video shows him rather disgusted at his caddy, but taking the club and throwing it into a bush. That to me is a clear action saying that this club is out of play.
And the caddy's out of a job.
And the caddy's out of a job. If a club taken out of play is another player's club, that other player may continue to use the club. This applies only in a situation in which you're on the course and John and I are playing on the second hole and I grab his driver by mistake and hit a ball. I then have breached the rule. I have to declare that out of play, but John can continue to use it. Why? Because it's one of his 14 clubs that he started with. Before round, this is a very narrow exception. It was part of the rules about, oh, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago that irritated a lot of people. So they came up with this very narrow exception. If a player becomes aware shortly before a round that they accidentally, and I would emphasize the word accidentally, have more than 14 clubs, the player should leave the excess club behind. But as an option, the player may take any such excess club out of play before the start of the round by declaring it so. The excess club may be kept by the player, but not be used. So that's a situation there that you don't have to throw it into the bush. You could put it in your golf cart or do something else with it. If the player deliberately brings more than 14 clubs to the first tee and starts the round without leaving the excess club behind, this option is not allowed. So the example there is you haven't made a decision, you got your 15 clubs and you say, I don't know which one I'm going to leave behind. And so you then make some announcement.
What was the folder called, Doug?
You leave the club. The question was, if you bring it deliberately, this rule doesn't apply. So that if you start the round with the 15 clubs, you're going to get the penalty. All right, let's move to balls. Conforming ball must be played. In making each stroke, a player must use a ball that conforms. This is the same concept in making each stroke. So if you hit a ball that is non-conforming, then that ball does not become in play, such as it's a provisional ball and that ball does not become in play, there is no penalty. The penalty only applies if the ball was hit as a stroke in the player's that would score. Player may get a conforming ball to play from anyone else, including another player on the course. So that means you can borrow a ball, but you cannot borrow a club. Deliberately altering ball must not be played. A player must not make a stroke at a ball whose performance characteristics have been deliberately altered, such as scuffing or heating or by applying any substance. Again, there's no penalty for adding a foreign substance to a ball. There's only a penalty for making a stroke with a ball that you've added a foreign substance to. Ball breaks into pieces while playing a hole. I confess I've never seen this happen. This is a throwback for the rules. Supposedly there was a problem 30 years ago with a certain type of ball that would break into pieces, and they had to have this in the rules. But in any event, if a player's ball breaks into pieces after a stroke, there is no penalty and the stroke does not count. The player must play another ball for where that stroke was made. The reference to 14.6, we're going to go over this, is simply the provision whenever a rule tells you to play from where the previous stroke was made, you have to look at 14.6, and it depends on whether it's the teeing area, the general area, or the putting green. And again, the phrase, the stroke does not count, means exactly that. There is no additional action that you have to make to cancel. This is not a cancellation of anything. This is just, you completely ignore the fact that a stroke was made. 4.2c, ball becomes cut or cracked while playing. If a player reasonably believes that their ball has been cut or cracked during the hole being played, the player may lift the ball to look at it, but the spot of the ball must first be marked, and it must not be cleaned, of course, except on the putting green. If the player lifts the ball without having this reasonable belief, except on the putting green, fails to mark it, lifts it, or cleans it when not allowed, the player is going to get just one penalty stroke. John went over this. This is 1.3c, that you have just one penalty that is applied. All right, when another ball may be substituted, the player may substitute a ball only if it can be clearly seen. Those are the magic words, only if it can be clearly seen. Clearly seen by whom? Rule doesn't say. It has to be clearly seen. So often on the national exam, it's a player picks up his ball, sees that it's cut, throws it into a pond, substitutes another ball. Is there a penalty? And the answer is no, because the player clearly saw that it was cut. There's no requirement that they show it to anyone else or get anyone else's permission. It may be good practice to do so, but you're not required to do so. You get no relief if the ball is only scratched or scraped. And this happens all the time. As a rules official, you're called over. The person says, oh, my ball hit the cart path. This is terrible. I want to repair it. And you replace it. You say, no, you can't. It's not cut or cracked. I have a lot of those balls in my bag, I'll tell you that. If the original ball is cut or cracked, the player must replace either the original ball or another ball. If the original ball is not cut or cracked, then you got to replace that ball. If the player makes a stroke and an incorrectly substituted ball, the player gets one penalty stroke. Note that this is a change in the rules. Substituted balls used to be 2 penalty strokes, now they're just 1. Penalty for playing from the wrong place in breach of this rule, the general penalty under 14.7, use of equipment. 4.3. 4.3 applies to all types of equipment that a player might use during a round, except that the requirement to play with the conforming clubs and balls is covered by 4.1 and 4.2, not this rule. This rule only concerns how equipment is used. It does not limit the equipment that a player may have during the round. So you can have all sorts of stuff in your bag. As long as you don't use it, you're fine. So you can have a device that measures slope. That's fine. You can't necessarily use it. And we'll see that you can't, but you can have it in your bag. Allowed and prohibited uses of equipment. A player may use equipment to help their play during a round, except the player must not create a potential advantage. So the first thing to know about this, if there's no potential advantage created, you're not going to have a breach of this rule. By using equipment other than a club or a ball that artificially eliminates or reduces the need for skill or judgment that is essential to the challenge of the game. So what's an example of that? The ball's on the putting green. You take out your cell phone. It's got a little app on there, and you put it down, and it says, Dan, you're 20 feet from the hole. Aim 1 foot from left or right. That's a piece of equipment that artificially eliminates one of the skills necessary, which is the ability to see the line. The second bullet point is using equipment, including a club or a ball, in an abnormal way than making a stroke. Abnormal way means in a way that is fundamentally different than its intended use and is not normally recognized as a part of playing the game. So this is an example where you're using equipment that is not abnormal. Take an example of a golf ball. But if you do it in an abnormal way while making a stroke, then you're going to get the penalty. And the example of that is you're putting and you put a golf ball between your hands and your wrists so that the wrists don't break down when you swing. You have now used a golf ball, which is a permissible thing, but you've done it in an abnormal way as part of in making a stroke. This rule does not affect the application of other rules that limit actions a player is allowed to take with a club, ball, or other equipment, such as setting down clubs. So when we get to Rule 10, I think John's going to talk about that. A player is prohibited from setting down a club to show their line of play. That's covered by Rule 10, not by this rule. So let's look at the common examples of equipment that is allowed and not allowed. What is interesting about this list is that this is an examples list. This is a such as list. This is not an exclusive list. So if it's not on this list, your default is to go to the introductory language and say, does it create a potential advantage by taking out the skill, blah, blah, blah. So these are the 6 specific examples. Distance and directional information. Allowed. Getting information on distance or direction, such as measuring devices or a compass. So you can get to the course. You can know that the wind is coming out of the north. You don't know what north is, so you get out your phone and you say, oh, the first hole is directly downwind. That's permissible because you've used a compass to get directional information. You can also ask anybody. When we get to advice, we'll see it's not advice if you're getting directional information or where the location of the ball is. Not allowed. Measuring elevation changes. So you can use a distance measuring device that says the distance to the hole is 154 yards. What you can't do is that you can't use the device in such a way if it also tells you that, well, it's 154, it's playing 165 because of the elevation change. That's what's prohibited. Interpreting distance, we talked about using alignment device. An alignment device, this was, I think there was a clarification a couple of years ago. The concern is on the putting green, you put down a large ball marker that has some way to align the ball. You need to see the equipment rule. But basically, if you use a large ball marker that is designed to show alignment, you are using an alignment device and it's prohibited. Any ball marker, a standard ball marker, even if it has a line that shows the direction, is not a problem.
But the one that has the little bubble level is a problem.
That is a problem. If it has a little bubble device, because that is telling you which way it's going to break. 2, information on wind and weather conditions. Allowed, getting any type of weather information, including wind speed, that is available from a weather forecast, measuring temperature and humidity at the course. Not allowed, measuring wind speed at the course or using an artificial object to get wind-related information, such as powder and a handkerchief. So what is interesting about this is you get to the course, you can pull up your cell phone, you can say, get the weather report that says the wind is out of the north at 20 miles an hour. You can get out your compass to figure out where north is, and on you go. You can't take out a device, I don't know, it would be a windsock, I guess, and hold it up and say, oh boy, it really is 20 miles an hour, because you're getting that information at the course.
What about cigar smoke?
The question about cigar smoke, it says using an artificial device to get other wind-related information. My view is if you hold the cigar smoke up or the cigar up for this purpose, you have breached the rule. It's no different than holding up a handkerchief, and it's no different than holding up or throwing powder. But notice that you can get around this rule by throwing up grass. And the first professional tournament I ever saw was the great Mickey Wright. She played at Maple Bluff in 1960 something. And I couldn't understand why this woman kept picking up and throwing grass. And then whoever it was, my parents or something, said, oh, that's so they tell the wind direction. All right, information gathered before, during a round. Allowed, using the information that was gathered before the round, such as swing tips and such, and then recording information to be used after the round. So you can record your heart rate and that sort of information, as long as you don't use it in that round, so that at the end of the round, you can say, oh, when I putt, my blood pressure or my pulse rate typically goes up by 10 degrees. That's fine. You can't use it as part of the process because it says not allowed processing or interpreting playing information from the round, such as club recommendations based on the current round, or using physiological information recorded during the round. So you couldn't then have a device that says your pulse is racing, and then you say to yourself, well, I'm not going to make the stroke, or I'm going to do something else until it goes back down. Audio and video, you can listen to audio, you can watch video unrelated to the course, but the caution is you should show consideration for others. Not allowed, you cannot listen to music or audio that eliminates distractions or helps with swing tempo. So you could not have a metronome type device that you have on your cell phone that goes, back, and then that's your swing tempo. Watching video or competition that helps the player in choosing a club. So you can't watch video of the performance. There was an exception that was part of a clarification a few years back that dealt with PGA Tour. So the guy gets to the 12th hole at the Masters. He doesn't know what club to use, and he pulls up his cell phone, and the announcer says, boy, everybody who's played the 12th hole has come up one club short. And then the guy says, oh, I'm going to take one extra club. The exception is the player may watch video that is being broadcast to spectators at the course, such as a video scoreboard. As far as I know, in the WSGA events, we don't have this issue, but if you go to a professional tour, the professionals are allowed to look at a scoreboard or whatever that has the video being broadcast. 5, gloves and gripping agents. You can use plain gloves, you can use powder, you can wrap a towel around it, all fine. The definition of plain glove, there's never an issue if you just get your standard glove from your pro shop. What is prohibited is gloves that don't meet the equipment rule because they have some sort of ridge or device on them that allows you or figures out how to put your hands on the club in a particular manner. That's what's not allowed. And you can't use other equipment that gives an unfair advantage with hand positioning or grip pressure. All right, stretching devices, using any equipment for general stretching other than in making a practice swing, whether the equipment is designed for stretching or not. So it's fairly common for people to get to a course and stretch in some fashion. Sometimes they put their foot on a golf course and stretch. Sometimes they get out of a club, put it between their shoulders. Sometimes they take out an alignment rod and put it between behind their shoulders for purposes of stretching. That is fine. What you can't do is not allowed is using some sort of golf training aid, such as a weighted donut, alignment rod, in any way that creates a potential advantage for helping a player in preparing for and making a stroke, such as to help with swing play and grip alignment and ball position. I know I told this story before. Every time I tell it, Randy Warbeck says I've heard it 100 times, but it's still a great story. So I'll tell it one more time, and then maybe this will be the last year. First time I ever officiated was at Washington County. The best woman player in the state missed a putt on the 14th hole, which is a par 3. She went to the 15th hole. She took out her alignment rod, put it under her armpits, and simulated a swing so that she could get her putting stroke down. The question was, should that person be disqualified? Now, under the old rules, there wasn't a 2-tiered penalty system. It was if you did it once, you were done. Well, it was qualifying for a USGA event, and at the time, Bill Linneman said, well, let's not disqualify her now. Let's just see if she qualifies. And of course, as luck would have it, she didn't qualify, but she got into a playoff. So we said, oh, so let's hope she doesn't win the playoff. And then, of course, as luck would have it, she won the playoff. She's now qualified for the USGA, what was that, public links tournament. And then the question was, do we disqualify her? And Bill Linneman said, oh, I know the guy who'll know the answer to this. His name's John Morissette, and he's at the USGA. And I said, well, I don't know who this guy is, but I can read the rule and it says he's disqualified. John said, or Bill said, well, I'll ask John. So he calls John. John says, yeah, the rule says what the rule says, and this player was disqualified. And that's the first time I ever heard the name John Morissette. All right. The last thing I want to cover before we talk about medical reasons is I want to talk about 4.3A1, the limitation on green reading materials, and it is on page 67. This is becoming more and more common. It's worth going through. 4.3 limits the use of equipment and devices that might help a player in their play based on the principle that golf is a challenging game in which success should depend on the judgment, skill, and abilities of the players. This clarification limits the size and the scale. So it limits two things: of a detailed putting green map or any similar electronic or digital material that a player may use during a round to help with reading their line of play for a stroke made from the putting green. Small change for you who are aware of the old rule. The old rule applied for any stroke made. Now it's only for a stroke made from the putting green. But here's what it does. It limits the size of this map that any image on the putting green must be limited to the scale of 3/8 of an inch to 5 yards or smaller. Secondly, the book or other paper contained on the map must not be larger than a width of 4 1/4 and 7 inches long, although a whole location sheet that displays 9 or more can be on a single sheet. You cannot use a magnifying device or magnifying anyway to get the thing bigger, and any handwritten notes are allowed to be put on it as long as the paper meets the size limit. One of the concerns we had last summer was we had a player who used an electronic version. I think I know the brand name, but I don't want to say it because I may not be right on that. But anyways, he had it on his phone. And the question that I asked him was, could he pinch it out? Because if you can pinch it out, then you can get the 3/5 of an inch larger than the 5 yards. And the device or the app did not allow the player to do that. It specifically was designed such that it was a fixed size, and the player was then allowed to use that app just as if it were a paper. All right, and the last thing I want to talk about in Rule 4 is medical issues. Equipment used for medical reasons. A person is not in breach of this rules if they use equipment with a medical condition, so long as two things: the player has a medical reason to use it, and the committee decides that its use does not give the player any unfair advantage. So Tiger Woods always put tape around his fingers. He said it was to prevent blisters. Well, that's a medical condition, and that's fine. What you couldn't do is put the tape around 2 or 4 fingers for purposes of making your hand not break down during a swing, because that would then give you an unfair advantage. A player may use adhesive tape or similar covering for any medical reason, such as to prevent injury, but the tape or covering must not be applied excessively or help the player and more than is necessary for the medical reason. For example, it must not immobilize a joint. Player is uncertain about where or how tape or other devices applied, should ask the committee. The penalty situation, it's now a tiered position. Thank you. If the breach happens between 2 holes, the penalty applies. You know the answer to this because it's always on the next hole, except for the 14 club rule. Second breach, the penalty applies as disqualification. If the nature of the breach was entirely different than the breach resulting in the first breach, the penalty only applies if there has been an intervening event. So you're on the 3rd hole, you use a weighted donut, that's your first violation. Then you go a little bit further and you use a device that measures slope. The question is that second breach a disqualification? The answer depends on whether there's been an intervening event. And the intervening event is if you breach, make a stroke, breach, you're disqualified. Anything else? Questions on Rule 4?
A jacket or a sweater is considered equipment. Is that
Yes,
correct?
absolutely.
Now, if I pull this here to pin just to get the feel of pinning my upper arm against my chest for putting purposes, is that unusual use of the equipment? I've seen it done,
Yeah, the question is if you have a shirt and you pull the shirt and you tuck it under one of your arms for purposes of, I don't know what, but for some purposes of helping you with a stroke, is that considered an abnormal use? The answer is it's done all the time, and therefore I suspect the answer is it's not being done in an unusual way that does not have historical significance. What's the buzzword of that? Fundamentally different than its intended use. Is tucking part of a shirt under your arm fundamentally different? Yeah.
And I have one. I go to the course, I have an extra club, I take it out, I put it on the cart floor. I've got a 7-iron that I've taken out of play. During the course of the round, I break my 7-iron that is in play. And I now take the 7-iron that's on my cart and put that in play to replace the broken club.
The answer is no. I'll repeat the question. And not only is it a 2-stroke penalty, you're done for the day. The question is, if you take a club out of play, and the example was you took it out of play before the round, But even if you take the club out of play during the round, you cannot use that for any reason during that round. And if you do, it's a 4.1A penalty. I'm pretty sure on that, and it's a disqualification. Does that sound right, John?
Let's see, I can't do it. I'm just trying to see about the penalty.
Yeah, the bottom of 56. If a player makes a stroke with the club that is still being carried after being taken out of play or during the round, they are disqualified. So like I said, it's a severe penalty.
But you could go to your car and get another 7-iron, that'd be all right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
As long as you
See the
don't,
distinction without a difference.
Yeah, for sure.
there's a lot of things about the rules that are a distinction without a difference.
Well, I think part of it is just not to give players an incentive to show up at the first tee with more than 14 clubs.
I got a couple from online.
Yep.
It says, is applying Vaseline to the club face a penalty if that club is not used to make a stroke? I.e., is the application itself a breach?
The question is applying a foreign substance to a club head a breach in and of itself, or does the breach only occur if you then make a subsequent stroke with that club? And the answer is, it's only if you make a stroke with that club.
And question 2, it says in stroke play on hole 2 discovered, a player discovers he has 15 clubs, applies 2-stroke penalty for holes 1 and 2. Doesn't know he needs to take the club out of play. Does not make stroke with this club. Any issues?
The question is, a player has to take a club out of play for any reason. He does not take it out of play. If you don't take it out of the play, you are disqualified because you've breached 4.1C.
More?
Yeah, what are we?
So this one's kind of opinion, but kind of a question too. It says, so you can listen to background music, but you can't listen to music to eliminate distractions. It's hard to reconcile that.
I assume they heard it online. Yes, it is hard to reconcile, but that is the rule. You can listen to background music, but you can't do it for tempo purposes and other purposes.
That's all I have for this rule.
Okay.
All right, we'll finish up today with Rule 5, which talks about playing the round. And speaking of round, we'll start with that definition of round, which is on page 359, which is simply 18 or fewer holes played in the order set by the committee. So, earlier we had the good question, is a 36-hole match 1 or 2 rounds? And the answer is it's 2 rounds, and that does matter because that affects what the player is allowed to do between those 2 rounds. All right, purpose of Rule 5. This covers how to play around. When is a player allowed to practice before or during the round, when the round starts, when it ends, when play has to stop, how to resume play. Players are expected, there's that word again, to start each round on time and play continuously and at a prompt pace. Rule 5.1, meaning of round. 18 or fewer holes, but if a round ends in a tie and play will go on to continue a winner. Now, if this is match play, and this, then those extra holes are the continuation of the same round and are not a new round. So first, let's keep in mind that, in match play, for example, the Ryder Cup, there doesn't always have to be a winner, that in some competitions, a tied match is a perfectly acceptable result. But when there does need to be a winner, such as in state match play, that continues on a hole by hole basis, and that is a continuation of the same round. So if, for example, if the terms of the competition say if if match is tied after 18, players continue to 1, then between 18 and 1, the player is not allowed to stop at the practice area and hit 4 drivers for example, not allowed to change clubs, not allowed to ask someone for advice. That's why it's important to say in match play with extra holes that it's part of the same round. Stroke play is a very different situation because a playoff in stroke play is a new round. So that's a distinction. Why? Well, partly for practical purposes, because in match play, players will just go immediately from 18 to whatever their 19th hole is. Whereas in stroke play, playoff could occur 2 hours after a player finishes. But in stroke play, the fact that it's a new round means that if a player finishes, and while the player's waiting around to see if there is a playoff, the player is allowed to practice, allowed to ask for advice, allowed to switch out some clubs in his bag, and all of that. But one way that it could hurt a player, and Dan alluded to it in Rule 4, is what if a player realizes that, let's say it's an 18-hole qualifier that the player is playing in for a certain number of spots. And on the 4th hole, the player realizes, whoops, I've got too many clubs. And he says, okay, I'm going to declare this 4th wedge out of play. Player finishes the round, thinks he might be in a playoff, waits around, then learns he's in a playoff, goes to the playoff hole with 15 clubs still in his bag. Then as soon as he tees off in the playoff, what issue does he have? He started the playoff with too many clubs, didn't he? Because it's a new round. So, just because he declared that club out of play in the previous round does not mean it's also out of play for the next round. So we have to be careful in that regard. Where it says when a rule refers to actions taken during a round, that does not include when play is stopped under Rule 5.7a, unless the rule says otherwise. And that's an important distinction in that, for example, the advice rule, as we'll see, applies during the round, and it does not apply during a stop of play. So if play has been suspended, players are allowed to go to their swing coach and ask for advice and ask, why have I hooked my last 3 tee shots or what have you. So that's why that matters. Rule 5.2, practicing on the course before or between rounds. So that's all we're worried about now. Later, we'll look at practicing during the round, but right now, just before or between rounds. And first, we say what practicing means. It means playing a ball, but it also means testing the surface of a putting green by rolling a ball or rubbing the surface. Limitations for practice before between rounds apply only to the player and not to the player's caddy, because it's asking too much for a player to be responsible for what his caddy has done, since midnight that day. And, often players might not want to know either. Match play, a player may practice on the course before a round or between rounds of a match play competition. So if Jeff and I have a 9 o'clock match, if one or both of us want to go out and practice on the course before then, that's okay. The rules allow that philosophically, since we both have the same tee time, we both have the same opportunity to go out and do that. But if a committee does not want that to happen, because for fear of, say, interrupting the course maintenance that morning, by local rule, the committee could prohibit that. But otherwise, that is allowed in match play. Stroke play, very different, because in stroke play, let's say I might have a 7 o'clock tee time, Jeff might have a 2 o'clock tee time. So we do not have the same opportunity to go practice on the course. So it's going to be a different rule. In stroke play, a player must not practice on the course before a round, except player may practice putting or chipping on or near their first teeing area. practice on any practice area. And that's important to say, but sometimes practice areas are out of bounds, sometimes they're not out of bounds. And in cases where practice areas are not out of bounds, this allows the player to use that practice area. And likewise, that explains why, often on a local rule sheet, you might see a committee say, the practice tee and the short game area are designated practice areas, meaning that even though they are on the course, they're not out of bounds, the player is allowed to practice on them before the round. And the player is also allowed to practice on or near the putting green of the hole just completed, even if they'll play that hole again in the same day. Now that might seem a little far-fetched. When might that happen? Well, let's say it's a 9-hole course and everyone's supposed to play, go around twice. So if after you finish hole number 9, you practice putting or chipping on or near that, that's okay, even if you're going to be playing that hole again 2 hours later. That's what that is saying. But player does need to be careful, and let's look at interpretation 5.2b/1 in terms of what it where it talks about, or the last bullet point, player may practice on the course after completing play of their final round for that day. So what final round for that day means, and this is something that WSGA conducts a number of USGA qualifiers, and almost every single one of them involves a playoff of some sort at the end. And so this is something that has real application to what we do. And that is, if a player has played, let's say it's 18 holes qualifier, and there with the possibility of a playoff afterwards. And we go down to the, let's see, 4th paragraph. For example, having completed play in the stroke play qualifying round for a match play competition, a player practices on the course. After conclusion of play, the players tied for the last qualifying place. Ties to be decided by a playoff. The schedule will be played immediately. If the player's practice on the course was, well, all of a sudden now, he is not finished playing on that course for the day. So he has practiced on that course. So if the player's practice on the course was their first breach of the rule, the player gets the general penalty applied to the first hole. Otherwise, the player is going to be disqualified. So the lesson for the players is, if there's the possibility of a playoff on that course, don't practice on that course between your round and the playoff, just in case you are in that playoff. Now, the penalty structure is interesting. If a player makes a stroke in breach of this rule, they get the general penalty on the first hole. So in other words, let's say you have a player who he's supposed to start on number 10, but you see him hit a chip shot at the nearby 9th green. And if, as a rules official, you go over there and stop him after he hits that first chip shot, you've saved the player. And the player still in stroke play gets a 2-stroke penalty. But we'll see what would happen if he had hit 2 chip shots. Then he's disqualified. And one point to make, referenced, we still have, and we're going to have online clarifications on the USGA's website. And one of the 2 clarifications currently up there now deals with this, where it says if a player makes a stroke in breach of this rule, they get the general penalty. And that's not entirely accurate, because remember at the very start, what practicing means. It means more than just playing a ball. It also means testing the surface by rolling a ball or rubbing the surface. So that all of that is also folded into that penalty structure there. So that if a player, rubs the putting green, let's say of the 9th green before he tees off, he gets the general penalty. But if he rubs the green and then, let's say, hits a putt, then he's going to be disqualified. All right, rule 5.3, starting and ending the round. Well, when to start the round? The round starts when the player makes a stroke to start their first hole. So it's a very definite line as to when the player's round has started. And that's important because as we'll see, there are certain rules that apply during the player's rounds where a player has more flexibility before or after his round, such as the advice rule, right? And the player can ask for advice up until he starts his round. The player must start at and not before the starting time, which means the player has to be at the starting time and starting point set by the committee. So if a player, for example, has a 9 o'clock tee time at the 10th tee, he needs to be at the 10th tee at 9 o'clock. And if he's at the first tee at 9 o'clock, he's not satisfied this requirement because he is not at his starting point. And what does 9 o'clock mean? It means 9 o'clock and 0 seconds. So in other words, the player needs to be at the starting point when 8:59:59 changes to 9:00:00. At that moment, the player needs to be at his or her starting point. But if the starting time's delayed, for example, it could be the first hole is a reachable par 5. There's a little bit of a backup. Players waiting to go for the green in 2. Could be there's been a ball search. Could be there's a ruling. But for whatever reason, if the tee time is delayed, the player is not in breach of this rule if the player is present and ready to play when the group is able to start. So let's say a player has a 9 o'clock tee time. The player doesn't show up until 9:02, but at 9:02, the other players in the group are still waiting for players in the landing area to clear. And in that case, there'd be no penalty for the player because he was there at his starting point when it became possible for his group to start its round. So the penalty for breach of this rule is disqualification, but there's some pretty big and commonly applied exceptions to that. If the player arrives ready to play no more than 5 minutes late, so a player shows up at his first tee 3 minutes late, the player gets the general penalty on the first hole. So if it's match play, he's going to lose the first hole. If it's stroke play, he'll get 2 strokes added to the first hole. On the other side, if the player starts his round early, something that hopefully will not happen if there's a starter, but if the player starts his round early, but within 5 minutes, it'll be the same, the general penalty applied to the first hole. Because remember, the rule wants the player to start at the starting time, not before and not after. Exception 3 is if the committee decides that there are exceptional circumstances that prevented the player from starting on time, then there is no penalty at all, even if within the 5 minutes. So in other words, if there's an all-world excuse that the player is late, or that for that matter, the player started early, then there would be no penalty at all. So, common, but it takes a lot for this to apply. That, common example is the players on the way to the golf course and there's a car accident, the player gets out to administer first aid, or the player is required to stay and, give a statement as a witness of the accident or something like that. That is something for which the committee should be sympathetic and say no penalty, and we will fit you in where we can. Because that's one thing that can be difficult for committees. If a player shows up, say 30 minutes late, but with an all-world excuse, the other 2 players in this group are hopefully already on the second or third hole. So what does the committee do? They're going to have to just fit them in where they can. It might mean at the end of the day, turning the last group of 3 into 2 groups of 2 or something like that. But that can happen. Rule 5.3b, when a round ends, in match play, when the result is decided, and in stroke play, when the player holes out at the final hole, including correcting a mistake, such as, what happens if the player realizes he actually didn't hole out, need to go back and hole out, that all that's taken into account. Rule 5.4, playing in groups. In match play, because of its head-to-head nature, naturally the 2 players have to play in the same group. Because if Drew and I are playing a match against each other. What Drew does could well affect what I do. So I need to be able to see what he's doing so I can determine what I want to do. So in match play, they have to play together. In stroke play, the players must remain in the same group unless the committee approves a change before or after it happens. So if you have a case where one player simply hates another player and refuses to play with him, well, he either has to play and suck it up, or he can withdraw. That's really it. Now, when might a committee approve a change before or after it happens? Let's say a player withdraws during the round in stroke play, and the players know that, well, wait a minute, I still have to have a marker. So I'm going to ask if somebody in the group behind will move up and play with me, or if somebody in the group, or if I can play with the group in front, or what have you. In those cases, the committee should say, yep, that was a reasonable thing to do, no penalty. Because otherwise, the penalty for just going off on your own, breaking up the group, is disqualification. Rule 5.5. Now, talking about practicing again, but this time during the round or while play is stopped. First, while playing a hole, it's very simple. While playing a hole, player must not make a practice stroke at any ball, whether on or off the course. And it clarifies some items that are not practice strokes. Practice swing, when you're just hitting it, swinging it at air, is not a stroke, because there is not a practice stroke because there's no ball involved. Hitting a ball back to a practice area or another player when done solely as a courtesy, that's not considered to be a practice stroke. So if you're walking by, let's say the practice area borders the 10th hole, if you're walking down the 10th fairway, you flick some balls back to the practice area, that's okay, as long as it's done as a courtesy and you're not trying to figure out, what went wrong on the front nine. Our third, strokes made by a player in playing out a hole whose result has been decided are not practice strokes. And that's a little less straightforward. A couple of examples for that. Let's say Phil and I are playing a match, and on the third hole, it's a par 3, my tee shot's in a bunker, and Phil actually aces the hole. He makes a 1 on the hole. So the result of the hole's decide. He wins the hole, right? So would it be okay if I went ahead and played that bunker shot? Because ordinarily, as we'll see in the next section, you're not allowed to practice between holes from a bunker. So there's the question of, would that bunker shot be considered a practice stroke? And the answer is it's not, because of this bullet point, because I'm playing out a hole whose result has been decided. So that would be okay. What would not be okay is, say, if I had hit the ball onto the fringe and then I dropped the ball into the bunker and said, oh, let's see what I can do here. Because then I'm not finishing out, I'm not continuing play of the hole, I'm really practicing. Another example that has application to WSGA is with Stableford. Say a player reaches a point where he is not going to earn any points for a hole. So the result of that hole has been determined. He's going to earn 0 points. But if he goes ahead and let's say he'd hit his, 6th shot into a greenside bunker, if he goes ahead and plays that bunker shot, that would not be considered a practice stroke. So there would be no penalty for practicing in that regard. Now, so that's during play of a hole. In general, no practice strokes. Now, between holes, after completing a hole, but before making a stroke to begin another hole, player must not make a practice stroke. But there are some exceptions, that the player is allowed to practice putting or chipping on or near the putting green of the last hole or practice green and the teeing area of the next hole. So the keys there are that 1, it's between holes. 2, the type of stroke being made. It's only putting and chipping. Player can't go to the fringe of the green and hit a driver off into the woods because he's not putting or chipping then. And then 3, where those practice strokes occur. So it's on or near the last putting green. So let's say the player just finished the front nine. If he wanted to practice putting or chipping, he could do it at the 9th green. And let's say on the way to the 10th tee, he passes the practice green. He could do it there, and he could practice on or near the 10th tee area. So that's where he's allowed to do it. So between holes, putting or chipping in those 3 locations. But these practice strokes must not be made from a bunker and must not unreasonably delay play. So here's a question that, it's type of thing that doesn't come up a lot, but it's a good question in that it forces us to read the rules closely. Let's say there's a penalty area just immediately next to a putting green. Could a player practice chipping from that penalty area between holes? Would that be allowed? Yeah, it's on or near, and it's not a bunker, right? So that's okay. That's okay. A little unusual, but that would be permissible. All right, rule 5.5C, practice while play is suspended or otherwise stopped. A player must not, when play is suspended, player must not make a practice stroke except as allowed up above in 5.5B, such as on or near the last putting green, anywhere outside the course. For example, if it's an overnight suspension of play and there's a driving range right next to the player's hotel, he could certainly practice there. And anywhere on the course the committee allows. Remember, 1 year, I think it was 2000 US Mid-Amateur, there was a suspension of play. Practice area was away from the golf course. Phil, this was at the Cascades course, which doesn't have a practice area right there. And because time was very tight, the committee just said, hey, each player, you can hit 3 practice shots right before you resume play, just hit them off into the woods or wherever and go on. And, first the players had a hard time believing that was allowed. And secondly, they had to count their balls before they did that. But that's an example. If a committee wanted to, the committee could do that. Now, if a match is stopped by agreement and the players, by agreement of the players, will not be resumed on the same day, it's okay for the players to practice on the course without restriction. So, for example, let's say players are playing a match. 13th, they're on they get through 12 holes, play is suspended for either darkness or a thunderstorm, or the course is unplayable because of rain. When they come back out the next day, and let's say it's a public golf course, and they say, okay, yeah, you can resume your match, but you've got to pay a green fee just like everybody else. And if they say, well, if we got to pay a green fee, we want to get our money's worth, let's just start on hole 1 and just play and practice up until we get to hole 13, and then we'll resume the match. And that's okay. But that is match play. Well, let's take a look at clarification 5.5C/1 on page 82, because this is something that does come up a fair amount, especially where, let's say you have a situation where during the day play has been suspended, perhaps because of a thunderstorm. And as a result, everybody is not going to be able to finish. So then you're going to suspend play at the end of the day for darkness. And when you suspend play, a lot of groups elect to take their option to finish the hole they're on. So let's say you have a par 5 that you had 3 groups playing, and all 3 groups are going to finish that hole. So then when you resume play the next day, you have 3 groups stacked up on that next tee. So the question is, if you're in that 3rd group to go off, what are you allowed to do in terms of practicing? Because you're going to have 10 or 15 minutes between when the horn blows to resume play and when you can actually start your round. And as this clarification says, when plays resumed by the committee, all players who had started their rounds prior to the suspension have resumed play of their round. So therefore, players in the 3rd group, their round has resumed. Consequently, those players are no longer allowed to practice other than as allowed by Rule 5.5B. With a good example, player suspends play, resume at 8 a.m. the next day. Players group will be a third group to play, and they're not allowed to continue practicing on the designated practice area after play has resumed at 8 a.m. Could they practice putting or chipping on a practice putting green after 8 a.m.? They could, but they can't, go to the practice tee and hit shots. So something just to be mindful of, and something that does come up with some frequency. Rule 5.6, unreasonable delay and prompt pace of play. Player, and again, one of the themes for the changes to the 2019 rules was to help pace of play. And this is, and you see pace of play emphasized in several places throughout the rules. Player must not unreasonably delay play, either while playing a hole or between holes. A player may be allowed a short delay for certain reasons, such as if he's seeking a ruling, or player becomes injured or ill, or when there's another good reason. And that is intentionally vague, just because who knows what might come up. A useful clarification that comes up more than you might think is 5.6A/2 on page 83. It talks about if a player gets a sudden illness or injury, could be heat exhaustion, as we saw actually in the final match of the U.S. Women's Amateur a few years ago, or bee sting or getting struck by a golf ball. The committee should normally allow that player up to 15 minutes to recover. Key there is that this is intended to provide the committee some guidance, saying, hey, normally 15 minutes, but by using the word normally, that gives the committee some leeway. If the committee says, hey, you know what, this is such an extreme situation, we're going to allow the player more than 15 minutes, that's okay. That's not wrong. And then another useful add-on, especially at the professional level, where players have their personal trainers and people like that with them, the committee should also normally apply the same time limit to the total time a player uses when they receive repeated treatments during a round to alleviate an injury. Sometimes you'll see a professional player get stretched out between shots, which is okay. But what this says is that, the player doesn't have carte blanche to do that, that the committee should apply that 15 minutes to the total amount of time the trainer spends on the player, stretching him out. With that. Penalty for breach of this rule, it's a tiered penalty statement structure, and this is for both match play and stroke play. For one penalty stroke for the first breach, general penalty for the second, and disqualification for the third breach. And if there's a breach between holes, the penalty applies to the next hole, with the thinking that the player is delaying play of that next hole. Rule 5.6B, prompt pace of play, something, another section that is particularly useful to those that are new to the game, that are going through the rules book, trying to learn more about the game. A round of golf is meant to be played at a prompt pace. So that sends a strong message, especially to newcomers. Each player should recognize their pace of play is likely to affect how long it will take others to play their rounds. Players are encouraged to allow other faster groups to play through. And then we have some recommendations. In other words, actually, and it seems interesting here in the middle of the rules to have tips how you can play faster. Prepare for and make your stroke, move from one place to another quickly between strokes, move on to the next teeing area after completing a hole. Players should prepare in advance for the next stroke and be ready to play when it's their turn. And when it's their turn, it is recommended, emphasis on recommended, that the player make the stroke within 40 seconds. That's certainly not a requirement, and this does not, emphasize, does not mean that if you're just sitting out on the golf course and all of a sudden you look up and someone takes 46 seconds to play, you shouldn't immediately drive over and tell the player that he's penalized. It's all in context, but this is just sending a good rule of thumb, mainly for both for players and for committees. Now, playing out of turn to help pace of play. In match play, it's okay for the two players to agree to play out of turn for the purpose of saving time. So if Jeff and I are playing a match together and on the way to the 13th tee, even though I'm going to have the honor on 13, if I say, Jeff, I've got to go to the restroom, feel free to go ahead and tee off if you'd like. That's okay, because we're doing that just to save time. In stroke play, players are able to are allowed and encouraged to play ready golf as long as it can be done in a safe and responsible way. And Dan will talk about this next week with Rule 6. Now, the committees are encouraged to adopt a local rule setting a pace of play policy. And it could range from the checkpoint system, which we often use, to more of an individual system like you'll see at the professional tour level, where the individual groups and players are timed. So either way, this is just saying it's a good idea for a committee to do something, because invariably, if a committee does not set up a pace of play policy, what's going to happen? There's going to be a very, very slow play group out there that's holding up the whole course, holding up the competition. And if the committee just goes out and says, play quicker, and the players tell them to pound sand, that the committee's going to be hard pressed to say, well, you better, or else. The committee needs an or else in order to motivate them to play more quickly. And in committee procedures, section 5G, there are some recommendations for that, for what a committee can do. So,
There's a typo.
oh,
It's 5H.
oh, is it? It should be, oh, okay. All right. Well, Dan gets the typo prize for the day. That's a good one. Rule 5.7, stopping play and resuming play. When the players may, meaning they have an option, or when they must stop play. First, during a round, they must not stop play except in these cases. One, if the committee has suspended play, or two, in match play only, if the players have agreed to stop play for any reason. For example, let's say Dan and I are playing a match and the weather turns, not friendly, but the course isn't unplayable, but all of a sudden it's 40 degrees, it's windy, it's spitting rain, and that's a little too much for Dan. And he wants to, he says, John, what do you say we come back tomorrow when it's going to be friendlier weather? And I say, yep, that sounds good. And that's we can do that. But that is just in match play. And likewise, and this is an important one because it is literally a matter of life and death. Individual player, whether match play or stroke play, may stop play if he thinks there's danger from lightning. However, when the player does so, the player needs to report to the committee as soon as possible. That it's not a good idea for the committee or for the rules of golf to put a player in a position where they're forced the player to play where the player's in physical danger. So that's why this player still always has that option. Leaving the course is of itself does not constitute stopping play. So for example, if you hit a tee shot out of bounds and you hop over the fence just to retrieve that ball, you're not considered to have stopped play just because you have left the course. But if a player stops play for any reason not allowed under this rule, or fails to report to the committee when required, the player is disqualified. So, an example could be, player, stops at the turn to watch the Packers game for 20 minutes. The committee presumably would say that's not a good reason to stop play, and therefore the player would be disqualified. Rule 5.7B, what players must do when the committee suspends play. So there are two types of suspensions by the committee, each with different requirements. The first is an immediate suspension of play, such as when there's imminent danger, usually from lightning. If the committee declares an immediate suspension of play, the player must not make another stroke until the committee resumes play. And the committee should use a distinct method of telling players about an immediate suspension. So that's why, for example, on our hard card, we say that an immediate suspension of play is signaled by one prolonged air horn note. That's how players will know, versus for a non-immediate, a non-dangerous situation, suspensions usually from 3 air horn notes, so players won't confuse them. So that means if you're in the 15th fairway trying to figure out what club to use for your approach shot, and the committee suspends play, let's say for danger from lightning, then you have to stop immediately. You cannot make another stroke. Now, the quote unquote normal suspension of play, such as for darkness or for an unplayable course because of, let's say, too much rain on it. Now, what happens next depends as to where each group is. If all players in the group are between 2 holes, then they're done. They can't play anymore. They just have to stop. But if at least one player in the group has started a hole, then all the players in the group have the choice. They can choose either stop play or to play out the hole. So let's say if Dan, Jeff, and I are playing, and it's in the evening, we finished hole 17. I rush ahead and I tee off hole 18. Then right after I tee off hole 18, the committee suspends play for darkness. Then all 3 of us can finish hole 18, which, let's face it, is to our advantage, because that means we don't have to be back out the 18th hole at 7 a.m. the next morning. So that's something we would all like to do. So as long as one of us has teed off on that next hole, we're allowed either just to stop play or to play out the hole. And we're allowed a brief amount of time, no more than 2 minutes, to decide what we're going to do. And if we continue the hole, we can go on and complete the hole, or it's also okay if we change our minds before completing the hole. If it's a long par 5, we all hit our second shots, and then walking up to our third shots, we say, you know what, it really is too dark now to play. Let's call it a day and come back tomorrow. That's okay too. But the players complete the hole or they stop before completing it, then they're done. They're not allowed to play anymore. Now, what happens if the players don't agree as to what they want to do? Say one player is playing poorly and doesn't want to hit another shot till he has some time on the practice tee. Other players want to get going. Well, in match play, if one player wants to stop, then the other player must stop also. And it's as simple as that. In stroke play, if one player in the group wants to stop, but the other 2 want to go on, that's okay. But the 2 that play on need to make sure that each one has a marker for the rest of that hole. So in other words, one thing would be to ask that third player who doesn't want to play, saying, okay, we understand, but Jeff and I want to continue on. Dan, would you mind just walking along and continuing to serve as my marker for the hole? And, Dan, hopefully would say yes, or he might say, forget it. My back's hurting too much. I gotta go in. In which case, if say my marker is not going to accompany me, then I need to stop also. Exception, no penalty if committee decides that failure to stop was justified. So the penalty for this is disqualification. So in other words, if there's immediate suspension of play, committee signals that, and a player goes on and makes one more stroke, that player is disqualified. Or with a normal suspension, if the players finish the hole they're on and then they go ahead and start the next hole, then they would be disqualified. This exception for no penalty applies if the committee decides that circumstances justify the player's failure to stop play when required to do so. For example, with immediate suspension, maybe one group was on at the far corner of the course and couldn't hear the air horn. Or maybe there was an ambulance going by and, they thought that the air horn was just a continuation of the siren from the ambulance, something like that. Then, those would be reasonable times for a committee not to penalize players. All right, rule 5.7C, what players must do when play resumes. So play has been suspended, whether for immediate suspension or normal suspension, but now it's time to resume play. First point, in a lot of ways, the most important point is this first sentence. The player must resume play from where they stopped play. So first and foremost, they're going to go back to exactly where they were. If a player resumes play from a different spot, then the player could be looking at playing from the wrong place. When to resume play? Well, this is going to be very similar to starting a round. Player must be present at the location identified above and ready to play. So just like starting a round, you have to be present at your starting point and ready to play at the time set by the committee, and the player must resume play at and not before that time. Now, if the ability to resume play is delayed, such as we saw when you have three groups on a tee waiting to play, there's no breach of this rule if the player is present and ready to play when the player's group is able to resume play. So let's go back to our practice example where we had the three groups waiting. And a player in that third group shows up and play resumes at 7 o'clock. Player shows up at 7:06 at that, say it's the 7th tee. But if his group is still waiting to be able to play, there's no penalty for that player for being late, as long as he is there when his group can resume play.
John, if he's the third player to play in that group,
Mhm.
and he shows up before it's his turn to play,
Mhm.
is he still good, or does he show up? Does he have to show up before the first player hits?
It would be, the question is, does the order of play matter? And the answer is it does not. It's just like on at the first hole.
Okay,
It's
so
the
when it's the
same
group's
thing.
turn, ready to play.
Right.
All
Exactly.
three need to be there, whether you're the first guy or the third guy.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. And that's a good segue, Phil, in that, we see the exceptions to disqualifications for failure to resume on time. We have those same exceptions for starting the round that apply. So the intent is to treat the two situations really the same. Rule 5.7D. The mechanics of what you're allowed to do when play stops, and then what you do when play resumes with regard to your ball. All right, so first, when play stops or when you resume play. When stopping play of a hole, the player may mark the spot of the ball and lift it. It's not a requirement. Player could just leave the ball out there. Let's say, for example, the player has hit his tee shot on the 13th hole. The committee suspends play, and the player, and let's say, there's danger from lightning. The player says, "Oh, that's it. I'm heading into the clubhouse ASAP," which is really what the committee wants the player to do. And the player just leaves his tee shot on 13 somewhere out there in the fairway. Well, if the player had gone out there and lifted the ball, then the player would replace either the original ball or another ball on that spot when it comes time to resume play. Or if the ball had not been lifted, such as with our example, where the player just immediately sought shelter, then the player is going to have the same rights as the player who had lifted his ball when stopping play. That this player may go back out to the 13th fairway, he may certainly play the ball as it lies, or mark the spot, lift that ball, and either replace that ball or replace another ball on that spot. So these two work hand in hand just to ensure that each player has the same rights, i.e. to make sure player can either put a clean ball down or put a different ball down, that there's no incentive one way or the other for the player to rush out there in a potentially dangerous situation and lift his ball, that he's not going to benefit from doing that. In either case, and this is where it gets a little tricky. In either case, if the line, meaning if the player had lifted his ball when he'd stopped play the day before or had not lifted the ball, if the lie of the ball is altered as a result of lifting the ball, so the process of lifting the ball somehow altered the lie, then the player is going to replace that ball or another ball as required in Rule 14.2D, which Dan's going to cover the details of that. If the lie of the ball is altered after the ball was lifted and before a ball is replaced, Rule 14.2D does not apply, and the player is going to replace either the original ball or a substituted ball on that spot. But if the lie or other conditions affecting the stroke will worsen during this time, Rule 8.1D applies. Okay, so in the second half here, if the lie is altered after the ball was lifted, but before balls replaced. So let's talk about two possible ways that could have happened. Let's say the lie was altered through natural causes. There's an absolute downpour, and that worsened the lie of the ball. Well, we haven't gotten to Rule 8 yet, but what's Rule 8 going to say? It's going to say, too bad, right? You just have to accept it. Whether if the rain made your lie worse, you have to accept it. If the rain somehow made your lie better, then it's your lucky day. But where Rule 8.1D would apply is, let's say that during the suspension of play, a spectator somehow had worsened the player's lie. Then Rule 8.1D is going to give the player some remedy for that, and let the player restore that as much as possible. And with that in mind, and kind of a more common situation is, let's look at clarification 5.7D1/1 on the very last clarification of the rule on page 85. When replacing the ball and resuming play, Rule 14.2D, which talks about what to do when you have to replace a ball, but the lie was altered, does not apply, and the player is not required to recreate the original lie. For example, player's ball is embedded in a bunker when play is suspended. During the suspension of play, the bunker is prepared by the maintenance staff and surface of the sand is now smooth. The player would resume play by placing a ball on the estimated spot, even though this will be on the surface of the sand and not embedded. So in that case, player gets a good lie, doesn't he? That morning, the maintenance staff completely raked that bunker, changed that player's lie, turned out for the better. The player's going to benefit from that. However, if the bunker has not been prepared by the maintenance staff, the player is not necessarily entitled to the conditions affecting the stroke that the player had when play was stopped. If the conditions were worsened by natural forces, such as by water, the player must not improve those worsened conditions. So could be good, could be bad. Now, what about the player's ball marker? That sometimes you'll see on television, the professional level, when players suspend play, you'll see them put down, multiple ball markers, a couple of T's or a ball marker and a couple of T's or something like that. But what happens if the ball marker is moved in any way before play resumes? Well, first point is, let's go back to the very first sentence of this rule. It says a player must resume play from where he stopped. So that's what we're trying to do. And ball markers do move, especially with an overnight suspension where, let's say, the maintenance staff has been out. If there was a ball marker in the bunker, decent chance the maintenance staff might not have seen that when raking the bunker, or if it's on the putting green or in the fairway, could have been moved by a mower. Things like that certainly happen. So the player would replace the original ball or another ball on the original spot. And, it's because the ball markers moved, it's a good chance the player doesn't know exactly where that was, in which case the player's just going to do the best he can and estimate where that was. So the player could just go right to putting the ball back, or player could use a ball marker, place a ball marker to mark that original spot, and then replace the original ball. So that is treated the same. So it's not, players shouldn't be overly concerned if, when play is suspended, their ball or ball marker disappears, that they will replace it. And that is rule 5, that dealing with suspensions of play is not certainly not a fun thing for committees to do, but certainly happens. And, I know those of you who were at the US Mid-Am last year, we had our share of suspensions and resumptions. Basically, I think we had 2 nights in a row of just about full course suspensions and evacuations for darkness, thanks to the weather delays. But any questions on rule 5?
John, have you ever had a situation where the conditions are worsened during the lifting process? What would be an example?
Yeah, and it's the question is, and it's a good one, is what's an example where the lie is worsened during the lifting process? And usually it would involve something like a ball that's, say, in sand in a bunker, and while you're lifting it from that somewhat embedded lie in the sand, the lie is altered. Could be improved, could be worsened, but it does change. Or it could be in tall grass, that generally if a ball's on short grass, it's hard to imagine how lifting it's going to change the lie one way or the other. So it's usually sand or tall grass, something like that can come up. All right, well, thank you all very much. Next week, we're meeting on Wednesday. Same time, 8:30. We're covering, was it rules 6 through 10, Dan, I believe. And I will be joining you all remotely then. And so fingers crossed all that will work. But thank you all. Off to a good start. And it's kind of amazing to think our season's still 4 months away.
That's right.
So,
Coach, he's going like today.